Welcome to Japan True Stories. Tonight, a quiet story from Japan. Settle in. These are voices from ordinary Japanese homes, where love and obligation often wore the same quiet face. Let them slowly carry you into rest. Somewhere in the still middle of a winter evening, a young man named Run was sitting on the wooden porch of a small Japanese house, and the word he had just said was still there in the cold air around him, small and honest, with nowhere left to go. The man sitting beside him on that narrow strip of wood, the man the word had been meant for, was named Kenji, and Kenji was what the world would call foster father, which is a description that captures the legal arrangement, but not much else about what the two of them had become to each other over the quiet years between then and now. What Ren had said, sitting there on the cold porch with the frost beginning to settle on the garden stones below them, and the paper screen behind them glowing with the warm light of the lamp inside. What he had said was the word for Dad. Not the formal version, the careful one, the one that lives in official documents and polite sentences, but the easy one, the warm one, the kansai word that fathers have been called by their children in 1,000 ordinary moments without anyone remarking on it. Because it is simply what children say when there is nothing complicated being said and everything simple is meant. He had said it without planning to, which was perhaps the only way it was ever going to happen. Kenji had started crying almost at once, which Ren had not expected and would not have predicted, because Kenji was not a man who displayed his feelings in visible ways, not a man who reached for the emotional register easily, not a man who had ever, in Ren's experience of him, simply given way to something he was feeling. But he gave way now, quietly and completely, his breath going uneven and the tears arriving without apology, the way water comes through a crack that has finally decided it has held long enough. And then, this was the part that would still puzzle Ren a little when he thought about it later. He had started crying too. He had been rather pleased with himself, up until that moment, for managing to get the word out at all without his voice doing something embarrassing. And then the next thing he knew, he was sitting on a cold wooden porch in December with his nose running and his eyes leaking and no particular plan for stopping. The two of them sat there in the cold without saying anything, side by side on the engawa, the narrow wooden veranda that runs along the outside of a traditional Japanese house. Just above the garden, a place for sitting in the mild evenings, and sitting anyway when the evenings are not mild, because some houses have a porch that pulls you to it regardless of the weather, and neither of them made any effort to compose themselves. This was by itself something, because both of them were people who would have done considerable internal work to avoid sitting in visible distress in front of another person. Ren especially had spent a good part of his life developing the art of not being seen to need anything, which is a useful skill when you're a child being passed from household to household among relatives who mean well in a general sense, but do not particularly mean well about you, who have a way of reminding you, without meaning to, that you are a circumstance wearing a child's face. He had been very good at the art, and the goodness had cost him in ways he was only beginning to understand now. On this porch, in this cold, with this word already out there in the air, and no means of taking it back. The winter garden was very quiet, the way Japanese gardens get quiet in December. The noise of the world held off by stone walls and bare branches, and the particular stillness that settles over enclosed outdoor spaces in cold weather, as though the garden itself has drawn inward for the season. The persimmon tree at the near edge of the garden stood bare against the deepening sky, holding its shape patiently the way trees hold their shape in winter, as though the business of having leaves is only a seasonal enthusiasm, and the real nature of the tree is this stripped and patient version, the one that does not change. Ren had looked at this tree many times from this porch since coming to this house, coming home, as he had begun to think of it somewhere in the middle years, without making a formal announcement about the change of language. And tonight, it seemed to him both entirely familiar and very present. The way things become present in moments that quietly ask you to pay attention. He had been 16 when Kenji and Hana had appeared in his life, which is a strange way to describe people who would become so central to it. But it was accurate. Two people somewhat distant in family connection, who had heard about his situation and said, with the kind of plain directness that turns out to be one of the rarer forms of kindness, that they would like him to come and live with them. He had expected something to be wrong with it, had waited for the hidden condition, had kept himself at a certain interior distance from the warmth of the place for months, not out of ingratitude, but out of the specific exhaustion of a person who has been hopeful before and learned what hope costs when it dissolves. But the hidden condition had not materialized, and the months had become years, and the years had settled around him gently, until one day you look up and find that you're somewhere you did not expect to be, and it is better than anywhere you had planned. Kenji had told him early on, and with considerable productive force, that he was not a lodger, not a guest, not a polite inconvenience to be temporarily housed, but a member of the household with jobs to do and opinions that counted and absolutely no need to pay rent, at which point Ren had been young enough and guarded enough to find this simply bewildering. But Kenji had meant it, which was the central thing about Kenji, the thing you came to understand over time. He had a way of saying things and then simply doing them without requiring much commentary on the agreement between words and actions, because for him, there was not much distance between them. He had shown up to every parent-teacher conference and every school ceremony and every Kendo tournament Ren competed in during those high school years, sitting 3 rows back with his arms folded and his face doing the thing it did when he was proud but was not going to make an announcement about it. He had argued, calmly and without leaving room for misunderstanding, that Ren should go to university, should go to the university that suited him best even if it was far away, and that this was simply what was going to happen, in the warm and absolute tone of someone who has made a decision and does not require anyone's agreement, only their cooperation. The light from the paper screen behind them wavered slightly as some small draft moved inside the house, the lamp adjusting, the air shifting for a moment, and the shadows in the garden rearranged themselves briefly and then settled, the persimmon tree resuming its patience, the stones resuming their quiet gathering of frost. Ren was aware, sitting there, of the cold coming up through the floor of the porch, persistent and mild, the particular cold that lives in old wooden houses and has always lived there and would go on living there long after everyone who had ever sat on this porch was gone. The cold of the house itself, the cold of the wood. He had missed this cold when he was away at university, had found himself in his modern apartment with its sealed, even warmth, and thought about the Ingawa and the garden in winter, though he had not, at the time, examined why he thought about it, because some things are easier to feel than to account for. Kenji wiped his face with the back of his hand, a practical gesture entirely without self-consciousness. The gesture of a man who has addressed a physical fact and moved on from it. Run did the same, and they sat for a moment in the quiet of that gesture, the two of them with their breath making small white shapes in the cold air, not speaking. Then Kenji said something quietly, murmured it, soft enough that Rin had to lean slightly forward to catch it over his own breathing and the faint, distant sound of a bicycle wheel somewhere on the road beyond the garden wall. He said something about Hana's grave, about going together that weekend, said it with the simple directness of a man who has decided the only way through something is through it, and Rin found that his throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Hana had been gone for some time by then, taken by an illness that moved faster than grief does, quietly and without the long warning that people in stories are sometimes granted, gone while Run was still in his early years at university, on a morning that had been entirely ordinary right up until it was not. The house still held her presence the way houses do when someone has truly lived in them. The arrangement of the kitchen, the hook by the door where her apron had always hung, the way the garden path was always swept clean because she had cared about the garden path, and now Kenji cared about it for her, without making a point of it. There were things Run had not said to Hana while she was alive, and the weight of those unsaid things sat alongside his grief in its own way, persistent and quiet, the way certain kinds of regret do not announce themselves loudly, but simply stay. He had not called her mother, either, had wanted to, had circled the word for years, had talked himself out of it with reasonable explanations about timing. And then the timing had run out, and she was gone, and the reasonable explanations had nowhere left to stand. The word tonight had been for Kenji, but it had also been, in some way Run was only beginning to understand as he sat there in the cold, for Hana, a reaching towards something he had not managed to say when the saying was still available to him. The only form of reaching still open to him now, which was to step forward instead. Kenji put his hand briefly on Ren's shoulder. Not heavily, not with ceremony, just for a moment, the way a hand finds a shoulder in the dark, not to say anything specific, but to confirm presence, warmth, the simple fact of another person there. Ren had not been easy with being touched for much of his life, had grown careful around it the way you grow careful around things that have been unreliable. And even now, even here, there was a brief flicker of the old instinct, and then it moved through him and passed. And he simply sat with the weight of the hand and found that it was comfortable. Some things change slowly, and some things change all at once. And some things change so gradually that you do not notice until you're sitting on a cold porch in winter with a hand on your shoulder and the December air clear around you. And you understand that the door you've been standing outside for years is already open and has perhaps been open for some time. He thought about all the meals at the low table in this house. The evenings when the television murmured in the other room and Kenji was falling asleep in his chair without admitting to it. The mornings when the smell of dashi, the clear, delicate broth that is the quiet soul of a Japanese kitchen, drawn from dried fish and kelp and water just below a simmer, had pulled him out of sleep earlier than he would otherwise have surfaced. He thought about Hana's rice balls, the particular ones she made with dried whitebait and bonito flakes pressed into the warm rice, which sounds very simple and was very simple, and which were for reasons he had never managed to articulate the best thing he had ever eaten, perhaps because she made them for him regularly and without ceremony, simply because he was there and because he was hungry, and because that is what you do. He thought about the morning the high school exam results had come in, how both Kenji and Hana had cried in the waiting room while other parents observed with what could only be described as polite bewilderment, because apparently this result had not required visible emotion from anyone else's family, and how he had been embarrassed and also deeply and quietly glad. He thought, sitting there with the frost settling below him and the word finding its new resting place in the air around them, that there's a kind of love that announces itself in small acts rather than in declarations, a love that lives in the light left on and the food kept warm and the argument about rent that is really an argument about belonging, and that this kind of love, by virtue of being steady rather than loud, is not less but more. The cold had deepened fully now, the December cold settling the way it does once the sun has been gone long enough, and the garden was very still, and above the bare persimmon tree the sky was the deep and particular blue of winter nights when the air is clean all the way up. Kenji said quietly that it was getting cold, which was true, and also the thing you say when you're ready to go inside, but not quite ready to end the moment you're sitting inside, the comfortable human habit of naming the obvious as a way of being companionable about it. Rin said that it was, which was not a complicated answer, but was the right one, and they sat for a while longer in the cold before either of them moved. The word was still there, the way words stay after they have been said, not floating but settled now, the way snow settles, covering everything it touches gently until it is simply part of the surface of things. It had taken him a long time to say it, and now that it was said, he found he could not quite reconstruct the shape of what he had been afraid of, which is how it generally goes with the fears that live inside unspoken things, large and necessary seeming right up until the moment they become unnecessary, and then just a shape that used to be there. Kenji was still sitting beside him, breathing the cold air in and out in the steady, patient rhythm that was the most characteristic thing about him. And the garden went on being the garden, and the persimmon tree went on being the persimmon tree, and none of these things had required the word to be said before they were true. But they were a little warmer now, all of them. Later, in the small hours, sitting with the glow of a screen and the need to set something down before it dissolved back into the feeling it had come from. Rin would write about this evening with the honesty that comes more easily in the dark, when the usual defenses are resting and the truth is a little closer to the surface. He would write about the cold and the frost and the porch, about Kenji crying and himself crying, about the two of them sitting in the winter without talking for what felt like a very long time. And he would try and not quite manage to explain why one small word had undone them both, which is to say he would try, and the trying would be honest, and sometimes that is enough. What the word had been, he would come to understand, was not quite a beginning and not quite an ending, but a release, the specific lightness of something long carried finally set down, The quiet surprise of noticing how light your hands are once you let go. And the answer Kenji had given him, not in words but in tears, in the unguarded and simple fact of an older man on a cold porch simply coming apart, had been yes, and had perhaps been yes all along, waiting for a question that Ren had finally managed to ask. On the porch, the two of them finally rose, a little stiff from the cold, not speaking, and went back through the paper screen door into the warm, lamplit kitchen, where the evening continued in the way that evenings do, the ordinary small progression of a night in a house that is a home. And the word, the simple, warm, unhurried word for Dad, said at last on a cold wooden porch in December, went inside with them. That is where this story begins, with a young man named Ren and an older man named Kenji and a winter porch, and one word said finally, landing exactly where it was always meant to land. And that, for tonight, is enough. The frost on the stones, and the lamp still warm behind the paper screen, and the word at last spoken, and the quiet that came after it, patient and soft as the winter dark. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet weight settling softly into the dark behind us. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take it. Let your breath fall slow, and even let your shoulders sink a little deeper into wherever you have made yourself comfortable tonight. The same night continues unfolding, unhurried, the way a river moves through still countryside long after everyone has gone to sleep. Our story has not ended. It only breathes, the way you are breathing now, gently, without effort. When you are ready, and only when you are ready, the next chapter is already here, waiting in the dark beside you, patient as candlelight. In a small house at the edge of a quiet hillside town, a 10-year-old boy named Rin sat across from his grandfather at a low wooden table and ate his rice with the careful, attentive manner of someone who has recently lost everything and is still working out what to do with his hands. His grandfather's name was Hiro, a slow-moving man with large, deliberate hands and a face that had spent decades squinting into sea wind. And he had arrived at the hospital the morning after the accident, spoken to the nurses in a voice that left no room for negotiation, and said simply that he was taking the boy home. Something had happened to Ren's family on a Tuesday in October. A matter of a car and a crossing. A moment in an ordinary afternoon that had no business containing what it contained, and the details of it were not something Ren could ever quite hold in his mind in the way you hold a normal memory. They were more like weather, those details present in every room he walked into, surrounding everything, part of the air itself, and yet not something he could point to and say, "Here, this is the shape of it, this is where it lives." He had lost his mother and his father in that moment, and his younger brother and his younger sister, and all the small surrounding things that make up a person's world without anyone ever naming them. The sound of his mother humming while she cooked, the smell of the back seat of their car, the particular way his father said his name when he came home from work in the evenings. But on that first night at his grandfather's house, Ren was simply there, sitting with his rice, watching the paper screens glow faintly from the lamp behind them, noticing the unfamiliar press of tatami through his socks, and not yet knowing what to call any of it. His grandfather said very little that first evening. which turned out to be precisely the right amount. He asked if Run was cold, offered a second bowl of rice, and when Run shook his head to both, simply nodded and went to wash the dishes with the unhurried competence of a man who had lived alone long enough to stop performing company. There was a dog, a broad, slow-moving creature of indeterminate origin who spent most of the day in a patch of sunlight near the back door, and who came to investigate Ren that first evening by pressing a damp nose firmly against his ankle, then apparently concluding that he was acceptable and retreating, satisfied, to his corner. Ren found himself thinking, in the sideways way that grief moves through a child's mind, that he did not yet know the dog's name. And that learning, it felt like the first small thing he was allowed to do in this new and foreign version of his life. The dog's name, his grandfather told him, was Kyomo, Cloud, which suited him perfectly because he moved through the house like something that had simply arrived there without particular intention and found no reason to leave. In the weeks that followed, the shape of a life began to arrange itself around Ren the way water finds its level, not by effort, not by decision, but by the quiet logic of things settling into the spaces available to them. He would wake in the mornings to the sound of his grandfather moving in the kitchen, a creak of the floorboard, the soft clack of bowls being set out, the low hiss of the burner catching. And there was something in these sounds, in the plain and reliable fact of them, that he found himself leaning toward the way a plant leans toward a window. His grandfather had a quality in his silences that was entirely different from the silence of being alone. It was a present silence, a warm and inhabited one, the kind that exists in a room where someone is simply there, living quietly alongside you, not requiring anything particular in return. On Saturday mornings, they walked to the library together, his grandfather moving at the deliberate pace of a man who has stopped competing with time, Ren keeping step beside him without being told to, and they would spend the better part of the morning there. Ren at the long wooden tables with whatever he could reach from the nearest shelf, his grandfather dozing in the armchair near the window with a newspaper folded neatly on his chest. He had come to the library habit on his own before this, had slipped away from wherever he was staying in those first bewildered weeks after the accident, and simply followed a road until something useful appeared. And his grandfather, when he heard this, had said only that it was a sound instinct, and returned to his soup. There was school too, the new school in the new town, with its particular smell of chalk and sneakers, and the quiet social architecture of classroom that had organized itself before he arrived, and Ren navigated it with the steady competence of someone who has learned that newness, properly managed, asks very little of you if you ask very little of it. He did not make many friends that first year, and he did not particularly mind, and his grandfather seemed to understand this without being told. There were no concerned glances across the dinner table, no careful questions about whether he had anyone to play with, no adult worry leaking through the walls at night. He simply lived alongside Run, the way a river lives alongside its banks, present, consistent, not demanding any particular response from the landscape, and that, it turned out, was quite precisely what was needed. There are years in a life that are made entirely of small things, and the 2 years Ren spent in that house were made of exactly that kind of material. The garden in autumn with its dry smell of raked leaves, Kyumo walking through the piles with absolute and peaceful indifference. Winter evenings when a heater ticked and his grandfather told quiet stories about the sea, not dramatic ones, not adventure stories, but the particular and unhurried kind about the color of water before a storm, or the way certain kinds of silence have a different weight depending on the weather. He remembered summer festivals in the town's small central square, the smell of grilled corn and sweet potato drifting on warm evening air, drums in the near distance, his grandfather standing beside him with his hands settled in his pockets, watching the paper lanterns drift past the trees, saying nothing and not needing to. He remembered learning, gradually and without ceremony, what it felt like to exist in a place where he was wanted not as a burden, not as an obligation that someone was managing with varying degrees of grace, but simply as a child, living in someone's house, eating their soup, permitted to use their library card without asking twice. He was 12 when his grandfather began to slow in ways that were different from before. Not the ordinary slowness of age, which Ren had always known, but a newer and quieter withdrawal, visible in the slight hesitation before a step, in a bowl of soup that sat too long growing cold, in evenings when his grandfather fell asleep at the low table before the dishes were done. Ren did not fully understand what he was watching. Children rarely do, when understanding would cost them something, but he understood it at the level where the body knows things before the mind does, and he adjusted himself accordingly. Carried more without being asked, said less, left the library books in places they could be reached without bending. His grandfather died in the early spring of Ren's second year of middle school, quietly, without distressing anyone, in the manner of someone who had seen to the arrangements and was simply following through on them. Ren was at school when it happened, sitting through a lesson he would afterward be unable to name, and he knew something was wrong before anyone told him because a teacher appeared at the classroom door and spoke to the other teacher in a voice too low to carry, and then looked at him with the particular expression adults give a child when the news is for them specifically and not the room. He walked home because there was no one to come and collect him, and walking felt more honest than waiting, and he sat in the empty house and listened to the particular quality of silence that a home holds when the person who made it a home is no longer in it. Kyumo sat beside him, which helped in a way that is beyond the reach of language to account for. The relatives arrived within the week. Several of them, from branches of family tree Run had never been given a map of, and they moved through the house in low-voice clusters, sorting and deciding, and Ren watched all of it from a careful distance, the way you watch something happening through a window when there is nothing useful you can add. He understood, without needing it explained, that the question now was what would become of him. The answer, as it turned out, was a succession of addresses, of bedrooms with other people's curtains, of meals eaten at tables where he was not unwelcome. Exactly, but not quite central either, the way a piece of furniture from one house always looks slightly wrong in another, present but not quite at home. The relatives were not unkind, most of them. That is worth saying clearly, with the fairness that comes from having had years to let the sharper feelings soften into something more accurate. And there were a handful who offered genuine warmth, and Ren remembered them without bitterness. And there were others who were simply going through emotion that life had placed in front of them, and he remembered those ones without bitterness too, because to hold a grudge against a person performing a duty is rather like being angry at the weather for being what it is. He moved 3 times before the end of middle school, or possibly 4. He would count it differently depending on when you asked, and each time he packed what could be packed, carried what could be carried, and turned his face toward the next address with the practiced, careful neutrality of someone who has learned that attachment to places is a luxury the present circumstances cannot quite support. He kept going to the library in every town. It was not a strategy, not something he decided on with any particular awareness of its usefulness. It was simply the habit his grandfather had helped him build, and it continued the way habits do when they are made of good material, almost without permission, outlasting the circumstances that first created them. In the libraries of 4 different towns, he sat at long wooden tables and read whatever was available, and felt the particular quietness of rooms designed for exactly this purpose, and let the hours move at whatever pace they wanted, and did not require them to be anything other than what they were. He became very good at studying, almost by accident, the way a person who walks the same path every day will eventually wear it smooth without intending to. The grades accumulated quietly, without fanfare, the way things accumulate when you're simply present in the right rooms for long enough. A teacher at one of the schools, the second or perhaps the third, the sequence had blurred at the edges the way sequences will when they're not especially pleasant to dwell on, stayed after class one afternoon and asked him, without drama or ceremony, whether he was sleeping enough, and Run had said yes in the manner that means, I am managing, which is not the same thing, but which is the answer that closes the subject without anyone having to proceed further. The teacher had nodded and then mentioned, as though it were an entirely separate and much smaller matter, that Ren's written work had been genuinely excellent, and Ren had walked home, to whichever home it was that particular month, with that small, plain observation sitting somewhere warm and quiet in the center of his chest, taking up no more space than it needed to, but staying. By the beginning of his 3rd year of middle school, he had been at his current address for almost a full year, and he had become fluent in the particular arithmetic of his situation, reading the temperature of rooms, watching the small changes in adult faces, understanding without being told when he was becoming inconvenient and adjusting himself accordingly. The way water adjusts to whatever container it happens to find itself in. It was an exhausting way to exist, though he did not call it exhausting, because he had no earlier version of himself to compare it against, no version who had lived differently and could say, yes, this is harder than the alternative. He simply called it living, and went on living it, and found in the libraries a kind of shelter that required nothing of him and gave him, reliably and without sentiment, the company of silence and the occasional sentence in a book that made the inside of his chest feel, briefly and unexpectedly, less like an empty room. He thought about his grandfather during those years, not with the sharp, inconvenient grief of the early months, but with the softer and more bearable kind that comes later, the kind that sits quietly in the chest rather than pressing against the throat. He thought about the Saturday mornings walking to the library, about the creak of the kitchen floorboard in the early light, about Kumo asleep in his patch of sunlight by the back door. Kumo had gone to live with a neighbor after the funeral, a slow and elderly woman who was clearly in need of a slow and elderly dog, and Ren was glad of this arrangement. He thought sometimes about the particular quality of his grandfather's silences, the warm, present kind, the kind that is not an absence but a form of companionship, and he would feel briefly and without being able to explain it to anyone that he was still somehow accompanied in those borrowed rooms, in those libraries, in those quiet evenings that did not quite belong to him. And perhaps that was the truest thing his grandfather had given him. Not the library habit itself, exactly, but the knowledge carried somewhere beneath the surface of things that stillness and company are not opposites, and that you could be alone in a room and still be, in the ways that matter most, held. It was near the close of the last term of middle school that the call came. A phone call first, then a meeting, then a tentative and careful conversation in which a couple Ren had never met sat across from him and explained, without pressure and without elaborate promises, that they had heard about his situation and wondered, quite simply, whether he might want to come and stay for a while to see how things felt. Ren listened to this with the patient attention of someone who has heard the general shape of such offers before, and who knows the particular way they tend to narrow once the initial goodwill encounters the daily, practical inconvenience of a child who is not quite yours. But he listened, and he watched their faces as they spoke, and there was something there in the measured way the woman chose her words, in the way the man leaned slightly forward in his chair as though the answer genuinely mattered to him, that he could not quite set aside the way he had learned to set other things aside. He said he would think about it, which was more than he had said to some of the others, and more, in truth, than he had entirely expected himself to say. And so the third year of middle school drew slowly toward its end, and Ren sat in his room with its borrowed curtains and the low, unremarkable sounds of an evening beyond the window, and thought about what came next with the careful, measured attention of someone who has learned, at a cost he never chose to pay, that hope is not a thing to be rushed toward, but to be approached slowly. The way you approach something you are not entirely certain will hold your weight. He was not unhappy, not exactly, not in any simple way that could be stated plainly. He was careful and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and very practiced at sitting quietly in a library until the light outside the window changed from afternoon to evening, and it was time, once more, to go wherever home was. The evening settled around him, as it always did, without asking permission, without requiring anything particular, soft and steady and unhurried, the way all the most reliable things are, the way his grandfather's silence had been, the way the sound of the kitchen in the morning had been, the way the best of things tend to be when they stay. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet details settling now into stillness, into the soft dark behind your eyes. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one. Let your breath come slow and easy. Let your shoulders sink a little deeper into where you rest. The same night is still unfolding. The same story continuing, only a breath further along, only a little deeper into that world. You don't need to hold anything. Let the sounds around you soften. Let your body grow heavier and warmer. When you are ready, and there is no rush, None at all. The next chapter will simply begin, carrying you gently forward. In a small, still neighborhood on the western edge of the city, on a gray morning near the start of the third term of ninth grade, a boy named Rin walked up to a house he had never visited before, set one suitcase down on the step, and waited. He was 14 years old, and he had been 14 years old in a number of other people's hallways by now. 6 houses since his grandfather had passed, each belonging to a relative who had taken him in for a while, and then, eventually, with varying degrees of kindness and difficulty, had passed him along to the next one, the way a parcel travels when no one is quite certain where it belongs. The couple who opened the door were distant relatives, distant enough that when their connection had been explained to him, Rin had listened and nodded and filed it away, and then found, over the following days, that the details had faded because the mechanics of the connection mattered less than its outcome. And the outcome was simply that a man named Kenji and a woman named Hana had said they wanted to take him in, and he had arrived. He was here with one suitcase, and the particular wariness he had spent 3 years quietly refining. Not bitterness, nothing as loud as that, but a calm, structural expectation that arrangements had terms and kindness had conditions. Learn the way a person learns anything from repetition. Not decided upon, not chosen, just accumulated over enough time that it no longer needed thinking about to remain fully active. Neither Kenji nor Hana performed anything for him, which was what he noticed first, standing in their narrow hallway with his coat still on, because people who took in children from difficult circumstances almost always performed something, a studied warmth, or a careful patience, or a kind of deliberate cheerfulness that announced itself and lay over the real temperature of the room like a fresh coat of paint. And these two were not doing that. And Rin stood in the absence of the performance and was not sure how to read it. Kenji was a trim, serious-looking man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, who considered Rin with the focused, practical attention of a person absorbing new information. And Hana showed him to his room with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone whose warmth lived in the doing of things rather than in the announcing of them. The room was at the end of a narrow hallway, tatami, a low wooden desk, a window looking out onto a strip of garden where nothing was growing in January, and a futon already laid with a new blanket in a dark navy cover. And Rin set his suitcase down and sat on the futon's edge and let himself take in the evidence of it. Someone had spent time on this room, had cleared it and cleaned it and laid out a new blanket, and that was a specific amount of effort directed at a specific person, before that person had even arrived. He found himself looking away from that evidence, the way you look away from something that asks to direct a question, and taking inventory instead, the way the window latched, the width of the desk, the sound of the house around him, whether the floorboards near the door would give him any notice. All the small structural assessments he had learned to run automatically as a way of orienting himself in spaces that had not yet decided whether they were his. At the far corner of the desk, there was a ring stain from a cup and a single character scratched into the wood, which meant someone had sat here before him and been here long enough to leave those particular marks. And Rin ran a finger along the edge of the scratch and thought, without quite finishing the thought, that this was a room that had held a life before and had been made ready, to hold one again. The first days passed with him moving through the house at a careful distance, learning its geography the way you learn a space when you are not yet sure how much of it you are allowed to occupy, which floorboards held noise, what time Kenji left in the mornings, how the kitchen smelled by evening when Hana had been cooking since late afternoon, the dashi broth and rice carrying through the hallway like a presence that had settled into the walls over many years of the same hour. The dog found him on the third morning, coming around the corner of the hallway with the absolute confidence of a creature that has never in its life entertained the concept of a stranger, stopping, regarding him for approximately 1 second with the calm gravity of something conducting a brief assessment, and then walking forward and sitting on his feet with the finality of an animal that has reached a conclusion and does not intend to revisit it. It was small and mop-like and white and apparently unbothered by the constant mild disarray of its own fur, and its tail moved back and forth with a kind of measured dignity. And Rin looked down at it and felt something shift very slightly in him. Not a decision, not even quite a feeling, just a small involuntary softening, the way a muscle releases tension it did not know it was still holding. Dinner was at the kitchen table at 7, and Kenji read the newspaper across from him and made occasional small sounds of disapproval at whatever was inside it. And Hana refilled cups without being asked, and the ordinary machinery of the evening moved through its familiar course around Rin, while he ate his rice and listened to the sounds of the house and thought about how strange it was to sit somewhere that was not asking anything of him yet. He was always waiting for the yet. It was the specific form his wariness took, not dramatic or oppressive, just a small patient vigil that had become so habitual it no longer felt like watching, the way a hand pressed against a wall for balance eventually stops feeling like an effort and simply becomes the position you are in. By the end of his first week, he had decided what to do. He would pay rent, not out of resentment, and not as a gesture, but because it was the sensible and correct thing, the move that named the transaction and gave it a clear shape that converted an unspecified obligation into a specified one, which was always preferable because unspecified obligations accrued in ways you could not track and landed in ways you could not prepare for. He worked out the number on a walk home from school one afternoon, moving through the thin winter light on the wet pavement with his bag over one shoulder and the arithmetic turning itself over quietly in his head. A reasonable number, one he thought he could earn with a part-time job, not so large as to be a statement, and not so small as to be merely symbolic. He rehearsed the words in the same deliberate way he did most things. Not until they were smooth, because smooth might seem practiced, but until they were plain and familiar. He appreciated the arrangement. He said to himself on the walk, he did not want to be a burden. He was planning to look for a part-time job and would very much like to contribute to the household expenses. On the evening he had decided upon, he waited until dinner was done and the table had been cleared and Hana had moved back toward the kitchen and Kenji was sitting with his tea, and then he said what he had prepared. The silence after was very brief. Kenji's face changed all at once, not slowly, the way an expression changes when a person is thinking, but quickly, the way weather changes in a closed space from one state to another without transition, and what appeared in it was not precisely anger, but something with anger's heat and directness, oriented not at Run, but at the specific idea Run had just introduced into the room. He said there was no rent, and he said it with the force of a man correcting something structural rather than something personal. His voice rising the way it rises when it cannot afford to be misheard, when the thing being said is too important to land quietly or leave any room for a second interpretation. He said that rent was what a tenant paid, and Rin was not a tenant, and that word had no place in this household and no relevance to whatever Rin's situation here was or had ever been. And then, with the same directness, the same plain certainty, he told him simply that Run was a member of the household, had been since he'd come through the door with his suitcase, and that members of the household did not pay rent, but they did contribute, and the contribution was not money but presence and effort, and he was happy to clarify what that meant in practical terms. Rin sat very still through all of this, and the part of him that was always quietly bracing for the catch had its hand partway raised, and then found that there was nothing to brace against, and did not quite know what to do with the absence of it, so remained halfway up for a moment before slowly, with some confusion, coming down. Because what Kenji was refusing was not the money, but the frame. The entire structure Run had walked into the room carrying. The transaction, the name debt, the protection of knowing exactly what was owed. Kenji was declining all of it, not as a negotiation and not as a performance of generosity, but as a matter of simple fact, the way you correct a misread map. Not unkindly, just plainly because the map is wrong and the road is actually here. Hana, in the kitchen doorway, had the expression of someone watching a thing unfold in exactly the way they had expected it to come, unsurprised, with a small quality of approval in the way she was standing, though she said nothing. The chores, Kenji continued, moving on from the main point with the efficiency of someone who considers it settled, which apparently it was, were two. The dog was to be walked each morning, and the bath was to be cleaned each evening, because these were the contributions that fell to Rin's portion of the household, the same way that other things fell to other people's portions, and that was the shape of it. He said it the way you say something entirely obvious to someone who has been making it more complicated than it needs to be, and Rin said he understood and nodded once, carefully, and he understood the words at least, and was still working on what to do with the rest. The next morning he walked the dog through the narrow streets behind the house while the January light was still pale and low against the tiled rooftops, and the air had the clean, cold quality of a morning that has not yet been entered by anyone else. And the dog moved ahead on the lead with the tremendous, single-minded purpose of a creature for whom every morning is an all-consuming personal project requiring complete attention. Its fur caught the pale light and seemed somehow illuminated by it, and the tail moved steadily, and the small earnest snuffling the dog directed at every crack and corner was so thorough and so committed that Rin found himself following at the dog's pace rather than his own, which was considerably slower and considerably more interested in the world than Rin's usual pace, and which made the walk take twice as long as it needed to. He came home to the smell of Hana's kitchen, miso and rice and something else, something warm and accumulated, The way warmth accumulates in a room that has been lived in at the same hours for a long time, until it becomes a quality of the air itself rather than something passing through it. He hung his coat on the peg by the door, which was the third peg, between Kenji's gray work coat on the left and a shorter one on the right that had been hanging there since his first morning. Already there when he arrived, the right length, the right size, waiting, and he stood for a moment in the hallway and looked at it and then moved on without saying anything about it to anyone, including himself. In the evenings, after dinner, he cleaned the bath, wiped the tile walls, scrubbed the rim of the deep soaking tub with a wooden-handled brush kept on a hook beside it, rinsed everything down until the water ran clear, and found after the first few times that there was something in the work he had not anticipated, a simplicity, a smallness, the plain satisfaction of a task that was just a task, that asked of him only that he do it, and implied nothing else, and held nothing back. It was a bath being cleaned, and when it was clean, the task was finished, and nothing further was accruing in the invisible column. And Rin found himself standing in the small steamed room after the work was done and thinking, with some bewilderment, that this was what a chore felt like when it was not also a down payment on something. The weeks gathered themselves into a month, and the month into several, and the neighborhood became familiar in the unhurried way that neighborhoods become familiar when you walk through them every morning at the same hour behind a small determined dog, the exact quality of the winter light at the far corner, the sound of radio from a window 2 houses down, the particular cold of the intersection where the wind came through between the rooftops. Kenji asked him questions across the dinner table sometimes about school, about something he'd read in the paper, about what Rin thought of a certain thing, in the straightforward way a person asks when they're genuinely interested in the answer rather than conducting anything. And Rin answered, at first in the careful, measured way of someone allocating most of his attention to being careful, and then, slowly, in a way that required a little less of that particular effort. Hana left small things outside his room sometimes, a warm towel from the dryer on a cold evening, a piece of fruit on a plate, a note in her small handwriting about what was in the refrigerator if he arrived home before dinner was ready. Unremarkable gestures, the kind that belong to the texture of a household and are not attached to any particular moment, and that Rin received with the quiet, steady gratitude of someone for whom they had not been a routine thing before. He thought about Kenji's words on the morning walks, turning them over the way you turn over something that is not yet finished telling you what it is, looking for the hinge, the condition, the part of it that would eventually clarify itself into a cost. Because Rin was experienced enough at being given things to know that the terms were not always named up front, and that patience was often the method by which a ceiling made itself known. And then, at some point he could not have precisely named, not with a decision, and not with any particular feeling of arrival, but with the quiet way that vigilance becomes rest when the thing it was watching simply does not change. He stopped looking for the hinge. Not because he had concluded with certainty that it was not there, but because the question had gradually, without ceremony, stopped being interesting to him. The way a question stops being interesting when the practical life around it has already given its answer and moved on to other things. The dog slept at the end of his futon on cold nights, something that had never been arranged or proposed, but had simply, at some undetermined point in the winter months, become the way things were, the dog having made its own assessment of the situation and acted on it with characteristic decisiveness. Kenji was at the table each evening with his newspaper and his tea and his sounds of mild, principled disapproval at whatever the world was doing that week. And Hana's kitchen light came on at 5:30, and the dinner was good, and the dog had been walked, and the bath was clean. Somewhere in the ordinary repeated texture of those things, without announcement or any moment that could be pointed to afterward, the word that had been said at the kitchen table, said loudly, said with more force than was strictly necessary, said in a way that left no room for misunderstanding, had stopped being a correction and had started being simply a description of something that was already true. Member of the household, Kenji had said, not a tenant, not a guest who might at some point require reassurance of his welcome, not an arrangement held in careful balance by the mutual good behavior of both parties, but a member of a household, with a coat on the third peg and a dog that had appointed itself the permanent occupant of the lower quarter of his futon, and a bath to clean each evening, and a place at the table where the cup was refilled without being asked. Outside, the winter streets were still, and the cold had the patient, unhurried quality of a cold that is simply the season, that does not require anything of anyone, that has been here before and will be here again, and against it the lights of the small houses were warm and steady, the way lights are in places that are not going anywhere. Pause. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting its quiet shadows settle and grow still, like the surface of a pond long after the last ripple has passed. There is no hurry here. If you need to shift a little to find that softer place beneath your shoulder, this moment belongs entirely to you. Breathe in slowly and let it go. Our next story takes us the same story continuing, the same night unfolding, carrying us gently forward through those same dark hours. The same stillness waits just ahead, patient as ever. There is nothing you need to hold on to. Simply let yourself drift, and the story will find you where you rest. Somewhere in the middle of January, on a morning when the winter had not yet begun to soften at all, Rin came downstairs and found them waiting for him. Kenji and Hana at the kitchen table, both already dressed in suits. Hana wore a pale gray jacket and a quietly pressed matching skirt, her hair arranged in a way he had not seen before, neat and very careful. The kind of arrangement that requires waking a full hour earlier than usual simply to manage. Beside her, in a dark navy suit that sat just slightly large at the shoulders, was Kenji, watching the kitchen doorway with the patient attentiveness of someone who has been waiting a while and has decided not to make anything of it. Neither of them was speaking. They were simply sitting there with the composed stillness of two people who have made a decision together and are now waiting for the relevant party to arrive so that it can proceed. Rin stood in the doorway, still holding the strap of his school bag, and tried to work out what kind of morning this was, whether he had missed something, whether there was an occasion he had simply failed to prepare for. Then Kenji set a folded piece of paper on the table between them and slid it slowly across with one finger. And Rin recognized it immediately, with the particular unease of recognizing something he had tried to make disappear. It was the career consultation form the school had sent home 3 weeks earlier. The one that asked students to indicate preferences for the future, to circle choices, to commit something about who they plan to become to the permanence of ink. And Rin had read it once, folded it into thirds, and placed it in the kitchen trash without allowing himself to think too carefully about what he was doing. He had assumed, in the way that certain assumptions settle into you, without ever asking permission, that the question of his future was not really one that anyone was planning to help him answer, or even one that anyone expected him to take especially seriously. Kenji told him, in the mild, unhurried tone of a man who has reached a decision and is simply informing the people involved, that there was a parent-teacher conference at the school that morning, that he and Hana would be attending it, and that it would be good if Rin came along. Rin stood there for another moment with the kind of stillness that is mostly internal processing, and then said something that amounted to agreement, and ate his breakfast quickly and standing up, because it seemed somehow wrong to sit down at ease at the table with two people in formal suits while holding a bowl of rice in both hands. The walk to school that morning was quiet, the three of them moving through streets that still held the cold at the edges, frost on the shadow sides of the low concrete walls, the sky the featureless white-gray of a January morning that had not yet decided what it was going to do. Rin walked a step or two behind Kenji and Hana, not from shyness exactly, but because he had not yet arrived at a settled sense of how to carry himself in public in relation to them, had not found the posture that said what he meant, which was something in the territory of, "These are the people I am with, and I am still working out what that means." Hana walked with her hands folded in front of her and said nothing in particular, and Kenji had his hands in his coat pockets and said nothing in particular, and the three of them passed the vending machine at the corner and turned left at the crossing and arrived at the school gate with a few minutes to spare. The school looked, from the outside, the same way it always had: low concrete buildings the color of old decisions, the gymnasium roof slightly dented at one corner, the cluster of bare winter trees near the side entrance. But the gate felt different to Rin today, heavier in some way he could not quite name. He had first walked through it alone, carrying a small bag and the quiet knowledge that he was the new student again, the transfer, the one whose file had arrived before he did, and about whom the classroom had not yet formed any particular opinion. And today he was walking through the same gate with two people in formal dress moving just slightly ahead of him. Inside, the conference room was small in the way those rooms always are in schools that were not built with extra space for soft occasions. A low rectangular table, 3 chairs in a row on one side, a single chair across, a filing cabinet in the corner, a window of frosted glass through which the winter light arrived flat and even and entirely without opinion. Rin's teacher was already there, standing near the table with the careful posture of someone who is aware they are about to do something that matters, a folder held loosely in one hand, looking up when they came in. He was a man somewhere in the middle portion of his career, with the kind of face that had probably always looked a little tired, the face of someone who had spent many years in the same classroom watching students arrive uncertain and leave changed in ways they would not understand until much later. And Rin had always found him difficult to read, which had been mostly fine because Rin had found most adults difficult to read. They all settled into their seats, the teacher on one side, the three of them on the other. And there was the brief interval of pens placed on the table, of the right folder located and opened, of the room arranging itself into the expected shape of a conference. And then they became still. The teacher began in the expected way, moving through grades and averages and attendance records. And Rin sat with his hands in his lap and watched the surface of the table and waited for whatever would come next. And then the teacher set his pen down. The register of the room shifted in some small but perceptible way, the way a room shifts when a person has decided to say the real thing instead of the expected one. And the teacher looked across the table with a different quality of attention. Not administrative, not managing a list, but something quieter and more considered. He said that Ren had been through circumstances that would have stopped many students entirely. Circumstances that had offered every reasonable excuse to set the books down, to let school slide away into some distant corner where it could not demand anything. And that Ren had not stopped, had kept arriving, had kept working, and that this was not a small thing, and he wanted to say so plainly. He said that he understood something of what it had cost, that he had been watching, and that he hoped, sincerely, carefully hoped, that Ren would be permitted to continue into high school. And then the teacher bowed, not the brief functional inclination that passes between people in a corridor, not the practiced social gesture of someone conducting ordinary business, but a real bow, slow and deliberate, the kind where the angle deepens far enough to become unambiguous, to carry something the words before it could not fully hold. It deepened until Run could see the back of his neck, the pale skin there, and he held the bow for the kind of moment that feels to the person receiving it considerably longer than it lasts for the person offering it. This teacher, who had watched Ren arrive in a new school in the middle of a year with next to nothing behind him, and had seen him work quietly through the remaining months, was now bowing to Kenji and Hana, as though Run were something precious that required the full weight of a body folded forward in order to be properly asked for. Ren looked at the surface of the table and found that his eyes had become warm and inconvenient at the corners, doing something he had not asked them to do, and he told himself it was the fluorescent light, which was genuinely harsh, and then told himself the room was probably dusty, which was entirely plausible for a room used infrequently. And he maintained this position for about 30 seconds before accepting that neither explanation was quite holding. The thing about being told plainly, and then shown through a body bowed forward, that your persistence across difficult years has not gone unwitnessed, that someone has been paying attention and found it worth asking for by putting their forehead close to a table, is that it tends to arrive with considerably more weight than expected, particularly when you had spent a long time thinking of persistence as simply the default mode of a person who had no other practical option. Ren had never thought of his years in the library, his careful note-taking in classrooms that were not yet familiar to him, his habit of rereading anything he had missed as anything worth a bow. He had thought of those things as just what he did, the ordinary maintenance of a life that did not have much else going for it by way of structural support. And the idea that someone had been noticing them all along sat somewhere in his chest now, warm and slightly too large to fit comfortably. Then Kenji spoke. He thanked the teacher, and the thanks carried the weight of genuine gratitude rather than social performance. The quiet of a man who has something real to thank someone for and is doing so directly and without ceremony. And then he said, in the same unhurried and matter-of-fact tone, that he expected Run to attend university, not high school, which had just been the subject of the teacher's bow, which would already have exceeded any reasonable expectation for someone in Ren's situation. But university, spoken with the calm certainty that people reserve for things that are simply and obviously what comes next, things that do not especially require announcement, because they are merely the natural continuation. Ren heard this and experienced, in the space of about 2 seconds, a vivid interior protest. The protest of a person whose life is being arranged in a room while he sits present, but somehow not quite included in the arranging. The feeling of watching a decision about yourself being made with confidence by people who have simply decided to have confidence about you. But the protest stayed quietly interior, because what happened around it was something that gradually dismantled it. The teacher's expression, which had begun with the startled look of a man who had prepared himself for moderate good news and received instead something outside the category he had prepared for, was shifting into relief, and then past relief, into the particular softness of someone who has been carrying a quiet worry for a long time and has just been told, simply and definitively, that it is no longer necessary. The conversation that followed included Run in the technical and geographic sense. He was seated at the table for all of it, present, attentive, but was not one he was particularly drawn into, which he noticed only distantly because he was occupied with the slow, strange sensation of watching a conversation about his future proceed with the ease and warmth of something already settled, already decided, by people who had quietly decided it without making a fuss. Kenji asked the teacher 2 or 3 specific questions about subject tracks and preparation timelines. Questions precise enough to suggest he had been thinking about this before the conference, perhaps on evenings after dinner when the house settled, perhaps in low conversation with Hana in the kitchen after Run had gone up to his room. Hana had produced a small notebook from somewhere inside her bag and was writing in it, her handwriting small, and even noting down what the teacher said about study programs and what the years between now and university tended to require. The handwriting of a person who is taking down something that matters and intends to refer to it again. Ren sat between them and tried to identify the feeling that had settled over him in that small room, which had no clean shape and was made of several things at once. The slight disorientation of having your future treated as something worth planning carefully by someone other than yourself for the first time, and the slow, cautious warmth of beginning to think that perhaps they had some point. They walked home through the same streets, the late afternoon light now thin and gold with January's modest best effort, and Kenji had taken his hands out of his coat pockets and was swinging them lightly as he walked, a thing that Ren had already, in 4 weeks, learned to recognize as what Kenji did when he was in a good mood. Hana said they should stop for groceries, and Kenji agreed, and they turned into the corner store where Ren was handed a basket and tasked with locating the right kind of tofu, which he accomplished after consulting the label 3 times to make certain he had the correct firmness, because it seemed important to get this one small thing right. On the walk home with the groceries, Hana mentioned that she thought Ren might do well in the sciences if he eventually chose that direction, and Kenji said he thought Ren would decide for himself what suited him. And Ren thought, carrying his share of the bags, that they were probably both right about different aspects of the same thing, and said nothing and walked. That evening, after dinner, after the dishes had been washed and the dog had been walked, and the house had settled into its quiet evening arrangement, Ren sat at the low desk in his room with his textbooks open in front of him. The desk lamp made a warm circle on the page, and somewhere in the house he could hear the faint sound of the television, and occasionally Kenji saying something and Hana answering in a low voice, and then the comfortable silence of two people in a room who are not required to keep speaking. He thought about the bow, the full deliberate angle of it, the held moment, the pale exposed nape of a man who had decided that words were not quite sufficient to the occasion, and what it had meant to be the person on behalf of whom that bow was offered, to be the reason someone had placed their forehead close to a table in a room with a frosted window. He thought about the career form retrieved from the trash and carried to a conference, smoothed back into something presentable, and what that retrieval said about the kind of attention that was now being paid to him, which was still new enough to feel slightly unreal, the way certain good things feel in the time before you have grown accustomed to receiving them. He thought about the word university, how Kenji had said it in that small room in the same tone one uses for things that are simply and obviously true, the next item in a series, the natural continuation, and how strange it was that a single word, spoken with that kind of calm certainty, could settle somewhere inside a person and simply stay there, warm and slightly astonishing and entirely unwilling to leave. The problems in the textbook in front of him were the kind that had been resisting him for a week, the kind that hovered at the outer edge of what he could manage. And he opened his notebook to the page where he had left off and picked up his pencil and began again. Outside, the January night had come in fully, dark and cold, carrying the distant sound of a car on a wet road, the brief bark of a neighbor's dog settling in a quiet, the faint rhythm of a train moving through the dark somewhere across the town. And inside the warm house, someone set a cup down gently in another room, and then there was only silence. He would not know that evening what came next, would not know about the high school entrance still ahead, the long concentrated months before it, the specific exhaustion that waits at the far end of serious effort, or the later morning when something he had worked toward would arrive, confirmed in plain official print. All of that was still folded into the future, unread. What he had on that particular evening was smaller and warmer and more immediate than any of it. A teacher had bowed forward until his forehead was close to a table, and a man in a slightly too large suit had spoken the word university in the tone people reserve for things that are simply obvious, and the lamp was warm, and the house was quiet around him, and the pencil was moving across the page. And somewhere in the house, the soft sound of two people settling in for the evening, and the dog finding its place on the floor, and the particular silence of a house that has people in it, the full, inhabited kind of silence. And that is where this particular evening rests, gentle and still, exactly where it belongs. And so we leave that hallway behind, letting it grow quiet and distant, the way all memories do when sleep draws near. There is no hurry now. If you need to shift, to settle deeper into wherever you are lying. This is the moment. Breathe in slowly and let it go. Our next story takes us back to the same night unfolding, the same soft darkness that held everything we just heard, still continuing, still breathing around its own gentle edges. You have nowhere to be. The night is long and unhurried, and these voices will stay with you, close and steady, like rain on a faraway roof. Somewhere in the first warm weeks of high school, Rin stood in a gymnasium doorway and watched a line of students in dark padded armor moving through a drill with long bamboo swords, their movements slow and deliberate as breathing, and something in him that had been wound very tight for a very long time simply decided. He had never belonged to a club before, not truly, not for long enough to matter. There had always been another move coming, another school, another set of faces that would not quite become familiar before he was somewhere else entirely. And so the act of writing his name on the sign-up sheet felt a little like making a promise to himself that he was not entirely certain he had the right to make. The shurnai, the bamboo practice sword, was heavier than it looked, and his wrists complained about this for the better part of 2 weeks, and the senpai, the older students, corrected his stance with a patience that was not especially warm, but was not unkind either. The kind of repeated calm correction that simply means a teacher has learned that bodies need to be told the same thing more than once before it becomes habit. He came home to the house in the evenings with sore arms and a particular focused tiredness that he found, to his mild surprise, pleasant, a tiredness that had come from work he had chosen, which was a different kind than any he had known before. Hana would have food ready, or nearly ready, and the smell of dashi broth would meet him at the Jenkin, the small entryway where shoes were left, and the dog, the small white mop of a creature who had decided in the first week that Run was his particular person, would appear from wherever the dog had been and sit at his feet with an air of dignified welcome. Kenji, most evenings, would ask a question or two about practice, not with great fanfare, just in the way of someone who has noted that a thing is begun and is keeping a quiet account of it. And Run would answer briefly, and dinner would settle around them all, and the evening would pass in the unhurried way that evenings had begun to pass in this house, which was its own quiet gift. He had not expected, when he joined, that Kenji and Hana would come to the tournaments. He had mentioned one evening over rice balls, Hana's particular rice balls made with dried sardines and bonito flakes that he had, without planning to, come to love as one of the fixed coordinates of his week, that there was a qualifying round the following Saturday, and then he had thought nothing more of it, the way you mentioned something and let it pass. The morning of the tournament, he left early with his equipment bag over one shoulder, his nerves gathered somewhere below his ribs, his mind occupied entirely with footwork and timing and the particular quality of calm you're supposed to achieve before a match and never quite do. And then, between his first round match and his second, in the low wooden bleachers where the families of other students had arranged themselves with thermoses and quiet conversation and the patient ease of people who had done this before, he looked up, and there were Kenji and Hana. Kenji was wearing a jacket that had clearly been ironed for the occasion. Ren had never seen him iron a jacket, was not entirely certain Kenji knew how to iron a jacket, but someone had, and Hana was holding a sign, cardboard with his name in careful block marker, the kind of sign that belongs at a children's swimming carnival or a school sports day. Not here, not in a high school Kendo gymnasium. When Rin saw it, he looked immediately and thoroughly in the opposite direction and became very interested in a point on the far wall. He won the first round match and lost the second to a third-year student whose footwork seemed, from the inside of the match, to be operating at a different speed than physics should reasonably allow. And when he stepped out of the ring, Kenji was clapping slowly, deliberately, each impact its own statement. The kind of clapping that says, I am here, I saw, and I am choosing to make this known. Rin found himself intensely occupied with the straps of his equipment bag, which apparently required a great deal of careful readjustment. In the car home, he told himself it was embarrassing, which was true a little, but there was something underneath the embarrassment, something warmer and more stubborn, that sat in his chest and declined to be argued with. The months moved through practice and through study, and his Kendo improved in the patient, incremental way that skill improves when you are willing to be bad at something long enough to get better. A month where his cuts were too stiff, a week where his footwork finally began to feel less like an obligation and more like movement. An afternoon where a senpai said only good and walked past, which Rin chose to read as something close to high praise. He placed in his first inter-school tournament, fourth, which was still on the podium, and Hana said very quietly on the way home that she had not known before this year that Kendo was quite so beautiful to watch, which was from Hana approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. The sign appeared at each tournament, a little more weathered each time, the letters slightly more worn at the corners, and Rin no longer found it necessary to look sharply in the opposite direction when he spotted it, though he maintained a careful neutrality of expression that he hoped communicated nothing in particular. The tournament he would remember longest came in the spring of his second year, a regional competition held in a gymnasium that smelled of cedar and floor wax, and the particular electric nervousness of 100 or so students and parents gathered in a place where something was going to be decided. He moved through the bracket with a quality of focus that surprised even him, a gathered stillness that he had been working toward for nearly 2 years and that arrived on that particular morning without effort, as though it had been waiting quietly for the right occasion. He won the quarterfinals against a student who was faster but impatient, won the semifinals against a first year who was technically careful but let his attention flicker in the third exchange, and then stood in the final ring against a boy from another school who had been training since the age of 7 and who moved the way people move when something is simply a part of them. He lost that match clearly and without dramatic incident, and he bowed at the end, and his opponent bowed, and the referee called it, and it was finished, and Rin felt in the quiet after, not disappointment exactly, but a kind of clean simplicity, the feeling of having done the thing as well as he had been able to do it. Runner-up. He held the trophy, a modest silver-colored thing on a dark wooden base, with a small engraved plate bearing his name and the year, and thought that it was more than enough, that for someone whose teenage years have been largely a sequence of temporary arrangements and borrowed rooms, runner-up a regional Kendo tournament was a remarkable amount of something very good. Kenji and Hana found him near the equipment room afterward. and Kenji took his hand in both of his own and held it in a grip that communicated, without words, a great many things at once. And Hana looked at him with an expression that was simultaneously very calm and entirely impossible to misread. That evening, Kenji made a reservation. A small, properly nice restaurant near the station where the counter was dark polished wood and the lighting was the color of late afternoon, and the chef regarded each dish as a matter of some personal importance. Hana ordered for the table with the practiced ease of someone who knows exactly what she is doing, and added a quiet word to the waiter about including vegetables alongside the main, and then turned to Run and told him he should eat more, and that this was not a suggestion. And Kenji, who in 2 years of living in the same house had not once, to Ren's knowledge, touched anything stronger than barley tea, ordered sake. A small ceramic flask arrived, and then, after a time, a second one. And over the course of the meal, Kenji became, in a way that was gentle and gradual and entirely charming, drunk, not loudly or mournfully, but in the way of someone who had held a particular formality in place for a long time and was finding, on this particular evening, that the formality was simply unnecessary. He talked more than usual and laughed more readily, and said several times, with the deliberate emphasis of someone who has been waiting for the appropriate occasion to say a thing properly. That runner-up in a regional tournament was a very significant achievement, and that Ren should understand this clearly and feel proud, actually proud, in a way that suggested he had been keeping this sentiment in reserve and was now releasing it into the world at the correct moment. He told a story, mildly incoherent, about his own athletic endeavors in his 20s, which appeared to involve a marathon entered on a dare and not adequately prepared for, and the story wandered without arriving at any particular destination. But this did not seem to concern him, and Hana listened with the fond, measured patience of someone who has heard the marathon story before and has made her peace with it. And then Kenji reached across the table with the broad-spirited confidence of a man who has had 2 small ceramic flasks of sake and has concluded that generosity is the governing principle of the universe, and pushed his cup toward Ren with a look that said, very plainly, that one small sip could not possibly constitute a problem on an evening like this. For a person who had just placed second in a regional Kendo tournament. Hana noticed this, as Hana noticed most things, approximately 3 seconds after it began. What followed was a scolding, brief, clear, and delivered in the particular register that Hana reserved for situations requiring no ambiguity whatsoever. And Kenji received it with the expression of a man who knows he is entirely, completely, indefensibly wrong and has arrived at a private peace with this fact. The cup was retrieved, the flask was not replenished, and the meal continued with the warm, ordinary calm of a dinner that has just had a small argument and found its way back to itself. The way such things do when the people involved are fond of each other. Ren watched this from across the table with his rice bowl held in both hands and felt something shift in his chest. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the quiet way of something that had been shifting for 2 years and was now simply further along in the process. This was what it was supposed to look like. He found himself thinking, a man who had a little too much sake and overreached, and a woman who caught it and pulled it back with exasperated affection, and a table between them that had weathered this kind of small moment before and would weather it again, and a boy across the table who was, without having planned it, watching something entirely ordinary and feeling, for reasons he could not have explained, grateful. In the car on the way home, Kenji dozed in the passenger seat with the untroubled ease of the pleasantly tired, and Hana drove with her usual quiet competence, and Rin sat in the back with the trophy balanced on his knees and looked out at the city moving past the window. It had been raining since they were inside. Had started without announcement, the way rain sometimes does, and the city through the wet glass was softer than usual. The street lights and shop signs and lit apartment windows all bleeding gently at the edges, as though the city had decided to take the evening less precisely. The wipers moved in their slow, even rhythm, and the radio was on at a volume just low enough that the words dissolved into something almost like music without quite being music, and Hana hummed something under her breath, some melody without a name that she hummed more or less constantly without ever seeming to notice she was doing it. The trophy was cool and a little heavy, and the small engraved plate on its base had his name on it in plain letters, and he ran his thumb across the raised surface without looking, just feeling the shape of the letters in the dark. He thought, in the unhurried way thoughts move when you're in a car in the rain and there is nothing left to do, about the years before this one. The guest rooms and borrowed corners, the school where a teacher had bowed his head toward a table with the particular force of someone who meant it entirely. The library where he'd spent his afternoons because libraries were always the same wherever you went, always that specific silence. Those tall windows, that smell of paper and settled. Time. And now there was this. A car moving through Tokyo in the rain, a sleeping man in the front seat who had gotten gently drunk celebrating a Kendo trophy, a woman humming something without knowing she was doing it, and a dog waiting at the house with its habitual devotion, and the trophy with his name on it resting on his knees, and the dinner still warm somewhere in his chest. When they arrived home, the dog was exactly as expected, positioned in front of the door, and moved aside with dignified reluctance, and the house was warm and smelled of the morning's cooking and the particular way the house always smelled in the evening. Something faintly woody, faintly of tatama mats, faintly of the tea that was perpetually either just finished or just beginning to be made. Rin went to his room and set the trophy on the shelf. The shelf that had been entirely bare when he arrived and was now, without any deliberate effort, lived in, a few books, a photograph from a school trip, and now this small silver thing with his name on a plate. He looked at the shelf from the doorway for a moment, and the dog appeared beside him and sat down with its customary patience. And from down the hall came the sounds of the house settling into its evening. The soft exchange of voices, water running briefly, a drawer closing gently. He changed and lay down on his futon and pulled the blanket to his shoulders, and the lamp from the hallway made a thin line of light under the door, and the trophy on the shelf caught a small glint of it, just enough to know it was there. The rain was still falling outside, soft and without urgency, touching the roof and the window without any particular intention, And he listened to it the way you listen to rain, when you're already warm and already still and there is nothing left to attend to. He thought about the sign, Kenji's jacket, pressed for the occasion, the careful block letters of his name on cardboard, the slow, deliberate clapping, where each impact had been its own statement, and how none of it had felt like performance, how it had felt instead like the grammar of people who simply showed up because showing up was for them, the thing you did. That was the thing he had not known how to want, he thought. Not to be praised, not to be rewarded, not to be seen in any large or ceremonious way, but simply to have someone who arrived without needing to be asked and stood in the bleachers with a handmade sign. The dog had settled against his feet with the boneless ease of a small animal who is determined that this is where it lives, and down the hall Kenji's voice said something brief and comfortable, and Hana's answered, shorter, still faintly amused, and then the house was quiet in the way of a place that holds its people gently without making a great deal of it. And he closed his eyes, and the rain went on outside, and the city beyond the window was soft with it, and the trophy sat on the shelf in the thin lamplight with his name on a small metal plate, and none of it was going anywhere. And that, for tonight, was where this chapter rests. And so we leave that hallway behind. Let it fade the way all things fade when the mind finally loosens its hold. There is no hurry now. If you need a moment, take it. Breathe in slowly, and let the breath go even more slowly, like fog drifting from a window into the dark. The night is still here, exactly as it was, patient and unhurried. And so is the story. The same night unfolding, the same quiet house waiting, the same voice ready to carry you forward whenever you are ready. There is nowhere else to be. Simply rest here, in this soft space between one breath and the next, and let the next chapter find you. In the small room at the back of the house that Kenji and Hana had quietly made his own, shelves added one autumn afternoon without announcement. A second-hand lamp with a shade the color of old cream installed without fuss. A small square of carpet laid near the desk, so the floor would not be cold against his socked feet in winter. Run had, over the months of his third year of high school, developed a relationship with late nights that could only be described as professional. The desk was barely wide enough for two open textbooks side by side, and he had learned over the weeks to stack them in the particular order that allowed him to move between subjects without having to lift anything. A small efficiency he was quietly proud of, the way you are proud of arrangements no one else notices. He had surrounded it over the long winter months with things that no longer needed explaining. Index cards in his own color system, a pencil worn down to 3 inches that he refused to replace, a practice booklet for mathematics whose pages had softened at the corners from handling, the way pages do when they have been consulted often and with feeling. National University entrance exams were spoken of at his high school with the particular reverence people reserve for things they are not sure they entirely understand. Teachers lowered their voices, wrote figures on the board with unusual care, let their gaze rest on students a moment longer than usual when they mentioned certain pass rates, as though checking whether the weight of the information had landed properly. Ren had decided, sometime early in his third year, that he was going to sit the difficult ones, the national exams, the ones his teachers were most careful about, not from ambition alone, though there was some of that, but because the alternative was to agree quietly and without argument with a low expectation of himself, and he had never found a way to make himself do that. Somewhere in the arithmetic of his life, the years of transfer schools, the borrowed rooms in one relative's house and then another, the library reading tables at closing time, he had arrived at a stubbornness that was not aggressive, but was extremely durable, and it had carried him further than it had any reasonable right to. Hana had watched the winter study period the way she watched most things about Run, which was with a steady and unhurried attention that never quite announced itself. The way you listen for rain without turning to the window, knowing you will hear it when it comes. She had noticed the weight coming off his face first, and then his shoulders, and then, by November, from his wrists when he reached across the table to pass her his empty bowl after dinner, and she had begun leaving things at the corner of his desk without comment. A small bowl of rice on some nights, warm tea on others, and most often the onigiri stuffed with small dried fish and bonito flakes, a combination she had made for him once, early on, in which he had eaten in complete silence, and then looked up with an expression that she had correctly interpreted as his version of a compliment. He never acknowledged finding the onigiri, and she never mentioned leaving them. And this arrangement had grown between them without negotiation, a small quiet agreement that asked nothing of either party and delivered something neither of them had named. Some nights, working past midnight, he would hear her moving in the kitchen, the soft drag of slippers on the hallway floor, the low sound of water filling the kettle. And he knew she had not simply happened to be awake, but had seen the light still on under his door and had gotten up. He found himself thinking on one such night in December, with the cold of the floor coming up through the carpet and the lamp warm above the desk, that no one had ever lost sleep specifically on his account before, not that he could trace, and the thought was too large to sit with comfortably. So he folded it away in the place where he kept things that had no immediate use and turned back to his practice exam. The cold that winter was the particular dry cold of Japanese interiors in January, the kind that lives in old wood and settles at floor level and lingers there regardless of what the thermostat says. And Ren had discovered that he did his best work in that cold, in the hours when the rest of the house was fully quiet and the only light anywhere was his, when the night felt like a room that belonged to him alone. He had lost, by his own rough accounting somewhere around mid-January, nearly 6 kilograms, not from neglect, but from the simple mathematics of hours, the way a person burns through the soft reserves of themselves when they are working very hard at something, day after day, week after week, without quite pausing to notice. He had not mentioned the weight loss, but Hana had noticed it anyway. And one evening she had sat down across from him at the kitchen table while he was eating and delivered, with the careful quietness of someone who had rehearsed the sentence and was hoping to not have to use it. The observation that National University was not actually necessary, that there were good schools much closer, that his health was worth more than the specific name of any institution. He had looked at her across the table with what he hoped was a reassuring expression and told her she was underestimating him, and then gone back to his room and studied for another 4 hours, which he felt was the more complete argument. Kenji had said less about it, as Kenji tended to on most things, but Ren had noticed in the sideways way you notice things you're not directly watching, that Kenji had begun coming home a little earlier in the evenings that winter, and that he would sometimes pause in the hallway outside the study room before continuing on, as though he needed to hear the specific sound of pencil moving on paper to confirm something that he could not otherwise confirm. What that something was, neither of them put into words, and this too had joined the quiet collection of understandings that made the house what it was. The exams themselves, 2 days in February, in a university building where the corridors smelled of chalk and institutional cold, the kind of cold that lives in stone floors and does not give way before late spring, past the way things pass when you have prepared for them honestly, which is to say not without difficulty, but without anything that could be called catastrophe. He sat at the examination desk and wrote for hours, paused to eat the onigiri Hana had wrapped in foil and set by the door the night before, still holding a small warmth, even after the train ride, and then wrote some more. And when it was over, he walked out into the February afternoon with his right hand still and his mind quieter than it had been in months, the way a room is quiet after a long gathering. The waiting period that followed was several weeks, which stretched in the particular way that waiting stretches when you cannot do anything useful with the time and yet cannot quite stop yourself from thinking about it. He filled the weeks with small tasks, carrying things from the car when Kenji came home, walking the dog along the canal path in the gray February mornings with the dog's breath making small clouds, rereading books he had already read because old books ask less of you, and the winter had used up most of what he had. Hana watched him during those weeks with an expression he could not quite categorize, something between concern and restraint, as though she were working hard at not saying a thing she had already decided not to say, holding it back with a practiced quietness. She kept making the onigiri even after the study sessions were over, and he kept finding them on the kitchen counter in the mornings, and neither of them said anything about the continuation of this habit, which had become its own kind of ongoing conversation, conducted without words, which suited them both. The results were to be posted online on a Thursday morning. A factorin had known for weeks and had tried, in the days preceding it, to not look directly at, the way you avoid looking directly at something very bright, and instead look at the space beside it. He was alone in the house when he sat down at the low table in the living room and opened the results page on the laptop Kenji had left on his study desk the previous spring, without note or explanation. A second-hand machine with a scratch across the lid that Run had needed several days to understand was not a loan, but a gift. He typed in his examination number carefully, 1 digit at a time. The page loaded with the unhurried ease of pages that do not know they are important, rendering itself 1 element at a time. And then the characters were there on the white screen, the kanji for acceptance, sitting in an entirely ordinary font, carrying the most extraordinary information, asking nothing of him, simply being there. He sat very still with his hands in his lap and waited, in the way you wait when you know the feeling is coming, but it has not quite arrived yet, because it is still making its way up from somewhere below the ordinary level of things, from somewhere deep. And then it came, not loud, not triumphant, nothing that resembled what exam result feelings looked like in the stories people told, but slow and spreading, The way warmth moves through you from tea on a very cold morning, thorough and quiet and entirely real. He thought, in those first still seconds, of the library in the town he had lived in at 13, the specific table near the back, slightly below a window that never quite closed, where he had done his homework because the house he was staying in that year was not somewhere he wanted to go back to before dinner time. And of all the transferred schools and borrowed rooms and late evenings and practice papers, it had taken him to arrive at this particular Thursday morning in this particular house with its lamp with the cream-colored shade. He thought of Hana's onigiri, wrapped in foil, still warm from the night before. He thought of Kenji pausing in the hallway outside the study room door. He found himself standing up from the table without quite having decided to. And then he was in the hallway, and then he was calling toward the back of the house because Kenji had come home early that day, which happened occasionally, and was somewhere inside. Kenji appeared from the direction of the kitchen with a dish towel in his hands and the mild, unhurried expression of a man who had been interrupted mid-task but did not mind particularly, an expression which shifted as he registered the look on Ren's face into something that had not yet made up its mind what it was. Ren opened his mouth to say the news, to deliver it cleanly, the acceptance, the university, the national exam result he had worked the whole winter toward. And what came out instead, before any of that, before any of the sentences he had loosely been preparing, was a word he had been keeping somewhere at the back of all his other words for a long time without quite admitting it was there. It was the small, intimate word, the one that in Japanese means father not formally but warmly. Not in the way you say it on official forms, but in the way a child says it who has been saying it all their life without thinking about it. The soft, everyday syllable that means the person you come home to, the person whose light is on, the person who pauses in the hallway to hear the pencil moving. The word surprised him as much as it surprised Kenji. There was a silence of perhaps 2 or 3 seconds, the exact length of a held breath, during which Kenji stood in the hallway with the dish towel and said nothing at all. And the house was very quiet around both of them, the kind of quiet that seems to have a weight. Ren felt the warmth begin in his neck and move upward through his face in the slow, entirely predictable, entirely unstoppable way of these things. And he thought, with the specific clarity that only acute embarrassment provides, that he had lived through a great many awkward moments in his life and had navigated most of them adequately, but that he had never assembled one quite as efficiently as this. He managed, after a moment, to continue to add the actual news on top of the accidental word, the acceptance, the name of the university, the national one, the first choice one, to recover the moment with information as best he could, the words coming out a little faster than he would have liked, the screen still faintly glowing in the living room behind him with its plain, unhurried announcement. Kenji heard all of it, standing in the hallway with the dish towel still in his hands. And then he set the dish towel down on the small table near the entrance, the one with the umbrella stand and the ceramic bowl for keys, and he looked at Ren for a moment with an expression that had moved, by now, past whatever surprise was and past the thing that comes after surprise, into something quieter and more settled, something that had found its level. Then Kenji said very softly that the news was good, that Ren had worked very hard, that he was glad. And these are the simplest possible words, and they contained, the way simple words sometimes do, considerably more than their face value would suggest. Rin stood there in the hallway and felt the warmth of the result on the screen in the other room and the warmth of Kenji's quietly inadequate words, and found that these two things together added up to something he did not yet have a name for, but that settled comfortably somewhere in his chest and showed no sign of leaving. That evening, when Hana came home and was told, she stood in the kitchen doorway with her coat still on and said she had known all along that he could do it, which was interesting, Rin thought, given that she had also spent 3 months telling him it was not necessary. And he found that both of these things were true at once, that she had believed in him and worried for him simultaneously, and that managing both of those things at the same time was a particular kind of person. Dinner that night was quieter than usual, in the way that dinners are quiet when something important has found its proper place and no longer needs discussing. And the dog lay under the table near Ren's feet, and the lamp in the corner made its ordinary warm circle on the tatami, and the kettle on the stove was the only thing that spoke. Afterward, washing the dishes at the kitchen sink with the water running hot over his hands, Ren turned over the thought of the word he had let slip, the small syllable that had arrived ahead of everything else before he could decide whether to say it or not. And he turned it slowly, the way you turn something over that you have found and are not entirely sure yet belongs to you. It had been true, he supposed, for some time already, in the way that things are sometimes already true before the words for them exist, the way the room had already been warm before he stopped to notice it was warm, the way the onagerai had already meant something before either of them had anything to say about what it meant. He did not go back to correct himself, and Kenji did not bring it up again that evening, and the house settled into its familiar sounds for the night. The creak of old wood cooling, a car passing on the street beyond the gate, the dog resettling in its sleep in the hallway. Ren dried his hands on the kitchen towel and stood for a moment in the warm kitchen doing nothing at all, which was, he noticed, its own kind of luxury, the kind that had not always been available to him, that he had not always known how to occupy without some task filling it. The lamp in the study room was still on when he went back to it later that night, as it had been every night of that long winter, but the textbooks were closed now, stacked neatly at the edge of the desk, no longer required, and the room was quiet around them. He sat down at the desk and did nothing for a while, which was unusual for him, and listened to the sounds of the house settling around him. Hana moving in the bedroom, Kenji coughing once in the way he sometimes did just before sleep, the dog's quiet breathing from somewhere in the hallway, and felt in the ordinary middle of these ordinary sounds something that had no precise name, but that sat easily in him, with room to spare. The word he had let slip was already beginning to feel less like an accident, and more like something that had simply arrived when it was ready, the way things arrive, sometimes when you stop holding them back without quite knowing that is what you were doing. And that, perhaps, is where we leave him tonight. There in the quiet room with the cream-colored lamplight, the acceptance still glowing softly on the screen in the next room. The word he had not planned to say already settling into something he could carry easily, the way you carry things that turn out, in the end, to have always been yours. And so we leave that hallway behind, its quiet details settling now into the deeper quiet of your breathing. There is no hurry here. If you need a moment, take one. Let your shoulders drop a little further. Let your hands grow heavy where they rest. The night is still around you, and there is nowhere else to be. Our next story finds us in the same unfolding darkness, the same night continuing its slow, unhurried passage, the same thread of stillness drawing you gently forward. Just follow the sound of the words. Let them carry you, and allow whatever thoughts remain to drift softly to the edges, like mist moving away from still water. Some months into his second year at university, Rin had settled into the warm and ordinary rhythm of someone whose life was for the first time moving in a direction he had actually chosen. Lectures in the morning, case readings in the afternoon, long evenings at the desk with the lamp on low, and the city a soft murmur somewhere below the window. He was the kind of busy that felt good, the kind that carries a sense of purpose rather than merely the sense of being used up, and he wrote home about his marks and his professors and the particular difficulty of one seminar on civil procedure. And Hana always replied that he was working too hard. She said he should sleep more and play more and let the law wait until Monday. And Rin always smiled at this and went back to his notes. She worried about him, still, she always had, but it was the mild and steady worry of someone who trusts a person completely and simply cannot stop watching over them all the same. The way you cannot stop watching a candle, even in a room where there's no wind. He had come to understand, somewhere in the years of living in her house, that her worry was its own kind of warmth, and he had learned to carry it with him into the long evenings without quite naming it. And then, on an ordinary afternoon, Hana collapsed. The news came by telephone, the way unexpected things tend to arrive, briefly, carried in a voice trying very hard to be steady. Kenji saying she had fallen in the kitchen, that the ambulance had come, that she was at the hospital now, that Rin should not rush. He caught the next train. The hospital room had that particular quality of evening light that comes through thin curtains and turns everything as soft and uncertain amber. The kind of light that belongs at the very edge of memory, slightly too warm and slightly too still. And it was the first thing he noticed when he came through the door, that orange glow pressing slowly against the fabric, filling the whole small room with it. Hana was propped against the pillows, smaller than he'd been expecting, or perhaps just more visible than usual, the way people become visible when the ordinary furniture of their daily life is stripped away and there is only the person themselves in a bed, in a room, with nothing between you and them. She looked at him when he came in, and she smiled, and her first words were not about herself. Pause. She asked whether he was keeping up with his studies, whether the commute from his apartment was manageable, whether he had remembered to eat something that day before he came. He told her he had eaten, which was mostly true, and that his studies were going well, which was entirely true, and that she was not to worry about any of it, which she received with the polite and entirely unconvinced expression of someone who has been worrying about you for years and sees no compelling reason to stop. Kenji was standing near the window with his hands in his jacket pockets. And when Rin looked across at him, Kenji said what the doctors had said, slowly and with some care, the way you say something when you have had a few hours to prepare the words, but nowhere near enough time to make them feel ordinary. "Stomach cancer," Kenji said quietly, and the curtain glowed. The light through the curtain was very bright, just then, pressing directly against Ren's eyes, and he found himself looking at the window rather than at either of them, and he remembered having a very small and quite irrelevant thought about the nurse, that she really ought to do something about those curtains, about all that light, which was quite unreasonably bright for a hospital room in the early evening. Pause. It was a thought about nothing, and it existed precisely to keep other thoughts at a slight distance for another moment, and he held it as long as it would hold. Kenji, beside him, also appeared to find the curtain extremely compelling, and they stood together in the amber room, all three of them, and the corridor outside moved with its soft and distant sounds, wheels on linoleum, a conversation, the gentle closing of a door, and none of them said anything about their eyes. Half a year is both a very long time and a very short one, depending on what fills it, and the half year that followed the diagnosis filled itself slowly, the way difficult time does, not with drama, not with the events that make a story easy to tell, but with the accumulation of small things, each one unremarkable on its own and impossible to entirely separate from the others. Ren learned the hospital the way you learn any place you spend a great deal of time in, without choosing to, the corridor outside Hana's room at different hours, the light in the morning against the left wall, and the light in the afternoon against the right, the names of the nurses he saw most often, which vending machine on the second floor was still stocked by mid-afternoon, which elevator was fastest from the entrance. He brought her things on his visits, the thin novels she liked, a small plant that required almost no attention, and the onigiri from the konbini near the station, the ones with the dried fish and katsuobushi, which was what she had always made at home, wrapped in the thin plastic they came in rather than the cloth she had always used, but close enough. She always unwrapped them with the same care, as though they'd been made with some attention, and she always said they tasted good, and he always knew she was being generous, and neither of them said anything about this arrangement, which suited them both. Pause. She was in all things kinder about his gestures than they deserved, and he had known this for years, and he had never quite found the way to say so. The doctor spoke in the careful language of medicine, which carries both the information and its shadow in the same sentence. And Ren and Kenji learned to hear both, the numbers and the timelines, and, underneath them, the quieter thing that none of them named directly, but that sat in the room with them whenever the three of them were together. The treatment proceeded, and Hana submitted to it with the practical patience of someone who has things she intends to return to, and she continued to ask about his studies at every visit, and about Kenji's cooking, which had become experimental in her absence, and which Kenji described to her with perhaps more confidence than the results warranted. She still had gentle, dry things to say about that, and Kenji still listened with the expression of a man who knows he is being gently corrected and is glad of it. But she shrank, there is no softer word, and he knew better than to look for one. The way sick people do, slowly at first, and then in ways you notice between one visit and the next, as though something essential has been quietly rearranged while you were not watching, and you come through the door and there's a little less of her in the room than there was the week before. Pause. her hair thinned, and then her hands and the pillows needed adjusting more often, and the intervals of waking grew shorter, and the waking itself became something she had to surface toward, a longer journey up from wherever she was. But when she surfaced, she was fully there, fully herself, fully present, still asking whether he had eaten and whether he was sleeping enough and whether he was working too hard. And he held those moments the way you hold something warm without thinking about it, grateful simply for the warmth. He learned in those months the particular quality of loving someone while watching them diminish, which is a thing you cannot prepare for, and which leaves a mark that is not precisely grief and not precisely fear, but something of both, carried quietly in the body alongside the ordinary business of the day. Toward the end, there was a sofa, a narrow hospital sofa, the kind that exists in rooms where someone is expected to spend a very long time, cushioned enough to be possible, but not comfortable enough to encourage sleep. And Rin and Kenji had taken to sleeping on it in turns, on the nights when the uncertainty felt too close to leave. The hospital had its own night sounds, which Rin came to know the way you know the sounds of home you have lived in long enough. The distant movement of carts along linoleum corridors, the soft conversation of the overnight nurses at the station down the hall, the particular hush of a building that is never entirely still, the faint machinery of the room itself, the city pressing its distant and indifferent sounds against the window from far below. On the last night, Kenji had gone back to the house to rest because Hana had been settled all evening, her breathing slow and even, and the nurse who had looked in an hour before had said she was comfortable, and it was Ren's turn to stay, and he had stretched out on the narrow sofa with his jacket folded beneath his head and his shoes still on. He told himself he would only close his eyes for a little while because that is always what you tell yourself, and because the alternative, lying awake in the amber dark, listening to each breath, was something he could only manage in short intervals before the tiredness pulled him under regardless. Pause. He slept. This was not something he would be able to think about clearly for a long time afterward, because for a long time it would feel like the kind of failure that lives in the body rather than the mind. And then slowly, across many years, it would come to feel like what it simply was: a young man, exhausted, lying down on a sofa beside his mother's hospital bed and sleeping. The way the body insists on sleeping when it has been stretched past its capacity for too many nights in a row. The way Shiwen was quiet. The doctors explained it the next morning, carefully, in the way doctors explain things when precision is the only gift they have to offer. That while she was sleeping, something that had been building in her sleep had entered her airway very gradually, and she had not woken, and there had been no distress, and the monitors had recorded the change the way monitors record everything, gradually and without announcement. Pause. Run, on the sofa 3 feet away, had heard nothing, because there had been nothing to hear, no sound, no movement, only the slow absence of something that had been present and then was not. He woke in the early morning to a quality of silence that was different from the nighttime silence, a silence with a different weight to it, and he lay still for a moment looking at the ceiling before he turned his head toward the bed. She was still. Pause. Not the still of sleeping, which always has something of motion in it, even at its deepest, but the other kind, the kind the body recognizes before the mind has finished its sentence. And he was off the sofa, and his hand was on her hand, which was cool and very light. And then the nurse was at the door, and then the soft and efficient machinery of the early morning moved around him, gently and without hesitation. He stood beside the bed for some time after, the window showing the earliest gray of the day. No amber curtain light yet, only the flat pale beginning of morning, and he held her hand, which was already some distance from where Hana had been, though it was still her hand. He would remember later that she had looked peaceful, not as a kindness, not as the thing you say because there is nothing else to say, but genuinely as a plain observation alongside the light and the hand and the particular stillness of the small room. She had looked like someone who had simply finished, quietly, without ceremony, the way she had always done everything. Hana had never made much of fuss. Pause. He thought of the television dramas he had seen over the years, the ones where illness is given its full dramatic weight, where there are final words and gathered families and the long choreography of farewell, and he found that what had actually happened was not a lesser version of that, not a failure of the story, but simply a different thing, swift and private, and in its way, true to her. She had worried about whether he was eating and whether he was sleeping and whether he was working too hard, right up until she could no longer speak to say so, and then she had gone without a sound, in the ordinary dark, the way a lamp goes out. Not dramatically, simply, completely. Kenji arrived an hour later, and by then Ren had spoken to the nurses and called the number he had been given and attended to the small practical things that exist, perhaps in part so that people have something to do with their hands in the time immediately after. When Kenji came through the door and saw Ren's face, neither of them needed to speak, and they stood together in the room for a while, the window admitting a little more morning now, and somewhere in the corridor outside someone laughed softly at something, and a delivery truck moved slowly along the street far below, and the day continued, as days do, without particular regard for what it had just been asked to hold. Later that morning, Ren returned to his apartment and sat for a while without turning on any lights, the day building itself around him through the windows, and he did not cry immediately. And then eventually he did quietly, in the way you do when you have been holding something carefully at a distance for a long time and the distance finally closes. He thought about the amber curtain light on the afternoon of the diagnosis, and Hana's first question, not about herself, never about herself, always about him, always whether he was eating and sleeping and not working too hard. Pause. He thought about the onigiri from the konbini, and how she had always unwrapped each one so carefully, as though it had been made with some thought. He thought about half a year, and what a half year holds when you are watching someone grow smaller than they were, and how you carry those intervals of waking, those moments of her being fully present, fully herself, asking her gentle questions, the way you carry something warm without thinking about it until it's gone. And sitting in the quiet of his apartment that morning, with the daylight coming in through the window he had not thought to cover, Ren found himself thinking that this was what steady love looks like when it has simply been itself for a long time. Not announced, not requiring acknowledgement, but persistent, the way light comes through a curtain, the way warmth lingers in a room, after the source of it has left. Pause. He made tea eventually, and stood at the window and drank it, and looked out at the city that neither knew nor could have understood, and thought of her. And that is where this part of the story rests tonight. In that apartment, in that quiet morning, with a young man standing at a window, and a cup of tea growing cool in his hands, and the particular weight of a world that had one warm thing less in it than it had had the day before. And so we leave that hallway behind. Let it drift back into the quiet it came from. You have no need to hold any of it. Just let it go, the way a breath goes, easy and without effort. Rest here for a moment if you like. There is no hurry, nowhere else to be. The night is still long and still gentle and still yours. Our next story is simply the same night continuing, the same soft darkness unfolding around a different door, a different silence. It is already waiting for you, unhurried, the way sleep itself waits, patient and close and kind. So take one slow breath now, and we will drift forward together gently into what comes next. On the morning of Hana's funeral, Rin stood near the back of the hall in a borrowed black suit that sat slightly wrong across his shoulders, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold before he ever thought to drink it. The hall was quiet in the way that funeral halls are quiet. Low voices, the weight of incense in the air, the slow and careful movement of people who are holding themselves composed, all of them performing the small dignities that grief asks of the living. White chrysanthemums had been arranged at the front of the room in long, pale rows, more of them than Run had ever seen gathered in one place. And somewhere nearby, a recording of sutras played so softly it was nearly indistinguishable from the hum of the building itself. He had not been given a place to stand or a role to fill, and so he stood where he had drifted, near the back, a little to one side, still holding the cold cup, watching the room with the quiet attentiveness of someone who has learned to read rooms from their edges. Kenji was somewhere near the front, receiving the people who came one by one to offer their words, nodding slowly at each of them. A small man made somehow smaller by the morning, by the suit that was too formal for his usual self, by the stillness of the face keeping itself arranged. It was when Rin set the cold cup down on a side table and shifted slightly that he caught the first thread of it. Two women, seated together near the chrysanthemums, speaking behind their funeral fans in the particular hushed tone that is designed to look private, but somehow always carries to exactly the wrong ears. He did not hear everything, only enough. Something about the way misfortune moves with certain people, something about Ren's arrival in the family, and then the grandfather passing, and now this. And didn't it make you wonder, really? One of the women glanced toward him, briefly, and he recognized the look, not actively unkind, more the look of someone who believes they are simply being realistic about things, which is sometimes a more efficient form of cruelty than the kind that knows itself. He stood very still, the way he had learned to stand still in middle school corridors when things were being said that he had no good answer for, a stillness that looked like calm, and was not calm at all, was in fact the opposite of calm held very tightly in place. He found himself thinking, in the quiet, sinking way that a person in a borrowed suit at a funeral will sometimes let their worst thoughts come and sit down beside them. Whether the women were, perhaps, right about him, and whether it was a reasonable thing for the people in this room to be afraid of him, and whether Hana's death was something he had brought here, carried in on his heels the way a stray brings mud. He was still standing there, not quite looking at anything, when the quality of the room shifted, when the air in the far corner seemed to tighten, and the low murmur of the two women stopped mid-sentence the way a sound stops when something larger arrives. Kenji had turned from the front of the room and was standing very straight and very still, facing the back of it. And the thin frame of him in the formal black suit was rigid in a way that his frame was not usually rigid, a different quality of stillness from the careful, composed stillness of everything else in the hall. And then Kenji's voice, which had always been the voice of a man who said most things quietly and meant them, came out of him at a volume that made the nearest arrangement of chrysanthemums tremble. Not figuratively. The stems actually moved. A volume that had no place at a funeral and was entirely unmistakable about not caring. He said, and the exact words are less important than the shape of them, that no one present would speak about his son in that manner, and that if someone disagreed with this arrangement, they were welcome to say so plainly, and the room could hear what happened next. A monk who had just stepped through the entrance at precisely that moment simply froze in the doorway. His prayer beads paused mid-swing, reading the situation with the carefully neutral expression of a man who has officiated a great many funerals and encountered very few situations he was not prepared for, and had just encountered one. The two women became very interested in the program in their laps, and the rest of the room found other things to look at, and the sutress on the recording continued serenely, as though nothing had occurred, which was generous of them. Ren had not moved, still standing near the side table with the cold cup. And the thing he would remember most clearly was not the volume of Kenji's voice, but the word Kenji had used, his son, spoken without performance, without emphasis, said plainly and flatly the way someone says a word they have been using for years without thinking about it, which is perhaps the most powerful way any word can be said. The rest of the funeral moved in the slow, necessary way that funerals do. The sutress, the incense passed and returned, the long patient queue of people waiting to offer their final gesture, each one brief and quiet and then gone, and then later the cremation, and then the part that came after. At the cremation, when the family stood together around the white bones that had been Hana, so small, Ren kept finding himself thinking she had always been small, but not like this, not reduced to something this light and this still and this final. He was handed a pair of wooden chopsticks, unvarnished, warm from someone else's hands before his. His hand shook, holding them, and the shaking surprised him, because he had believed himself to be holding together reasonably well, and it turned out that he was not, or at least that his hands were not, which may amount to the same thing. His throat had gone tight in the way it does when something has become entirely real, and the body acknowledges this before the mind has properly caught up, and he moved the chopsticks carefully and slowly, and tried very hard to do it correctly, because it seemed important to do it correctly, which is a thought that grief often gives a person a hold while they move through something they cannot stop. He had always believed he understood loss, having grown up inside it, had carried it from the age of 9, the way a person carries a thing they've been carrying long enough that the weight becomes normal, becomes simply the weight of how things are. But this was different from the losses that had come before, and he would spend some weeks afterward trying to understand exactly how. And the closest he came was this: before the losses had arrived, before he had much to lose, before he had learned what it felt like to come home to warmth, before he knew the particular smell of dashi stock beginning early in the morning, before there was a woman who stayed up late worrying about a university entrance exam she was not taking herself. The weeks after the funeral were quiet in the way that emptied houses are quiet. Not silent, but stilled, the way a room is stilled when the person who animated it is no longer in it. All the furniture in the right places and none of the life in it that made the furniture make sense. Hana had kept the house the way she kept everything, with an attention so steady and so undemonstrative that it became invisible, became simply the condition of things, and its absence was now equally invisible except that it was everywhere, in every corner, in the particular quality of the air in the mornings. Kenji cooked in his careful and methodical way, and the food was fine, and they ate together at the low table and talked about ordinary things: the dog, what the weather was doing, the small domestic accounting of a house, still going about its business. And there was something in the ordinariness of all of it that was itself a kind of grief, though neither of them would have named it that out loud. Rin watched his foster father in the way he had always watched him, with a quiet attention kept slightly to one side, a habit developed over years of living in other people's houses, reading the room before the room knew it was being read. Kenji slept badly, Rin suspected. The light under the bedroom door appeared late into the nights, and sometimes in the small hours Rin could hear the television murmuring to itself in the way a television murmurs when no one is really watching it, when it is simply providing the sound of another voice in a room that is otherwise too quiet. He did not mention what he had noticed, because there are certain forms of attention that work better when they remain unseen, and he had learned this the way he had learned most useful things, by getting it slightly wrong once and then adjusting. The dog, who had always held strong opinions about where to sleep, and had until now preferred the foot of Ren's bed, had silently transferred her allegiances and was now sleeping outside Kenji's door every night, which seemed to Rin to be both generous of her and entirely correct. It was on a Saturday several weeks after the funeral, a gray Saturday in early winter, the light flat, and even the cold, the quiet kind that does not bite, but simply settles over everything like something patient. Rin came home and went looking for Kenji. He checked the kitchen first, then the living room, then the room where the television had been doing its recent work, and not finding him in any of those places, went to the back of the house, to the glass door that opened onto the garden, and slid it open. Hana's garden, which had always been, quietly and entirely, Hana's, was visible in its current state of neglect, the beds overgrown, the late chrysanthemums gone to seed and drooping at their stems, the small stone path half buried under the fallen leaves of the last 2 months. Everything still present and none of it tended, a garden that had been loved by someone who was no longer there to love it. Kenji was crouched at the far end of it, in the corner where Hana had kept the plant she was most fond of, his back to the house and his back to everything else, wearing old clothes, work trousers, a worn jacket, and on his hands, Hana's gardening gloves, the floral pattern one she had left hanging on the hook by the door, slightly too large for his hands, the cuffs folded back. He was pulling weeds, slowly, with no urgency, just steadily, a small handful at a time, setting each one carefully to the side, his whole attention on the patch of earth directly in front of him, moving through it with the deliberate patience of someone who has nowhere else to be and nothing more important to do. Rin stood in the doorway and watched him for a long moment without speaking, and the cold air moved around him from the garden, carrying the smell of turned earth and the particular flat green smell of dead leaves and something underneath that was still alive. What struck him, what he would find himself returning to later, in the way you return to certain images, was how small Kenji looked from behind, how much smaller than the man who had stood in a funeral hall and silenced a room without effort, how the shoulders that had been so straight and certain that morning were now simply ordinary shoulders, slightly rounded by the cold, belonging to an older man who was sad and alone in a garden. The same hands that had gripped the front pew that day were now in Hana's gardening gloves, moving through her soil, pulling up the things she would have pulled up herself if she had been here to do it, tending what she had tended, in the only way left to tend it. He was murmuring as he worked, not words Rin could make out from the doorway, just a low, soft, continuous sound, the kind of sound a person makes when they're talking to themselves without quite realizing it, or perhaps not to themselves at all, but to something they're accustomed to speaking to, something that used to answer. Rin stepped out onto the garden path, and the gravel shifted under his shoes with a small sound. And Kenji did not turn around, but his hands slowed their work, paused for a moment in the soil, which meant he had heard. Rin crossed the garden slowly, in the quiet cold, the sound of the city kept at a distance by the garden walls, the flat winter light coming down over everything equally, and he came to stand a little behind and to one side of Kenji and looked down at the same patch of earth that Kenji was looking at. He could see what had been done. A small section cleared, the dead growth removed, the soil underneath exposed and dark and ready, a neat square of cleared earth surrounded on all sides by the still tangled rest of the garden. A beginning and nothing more. Not the garden restored, not grief resolved, just one cleared square where something might, in time, be planted again. Kenji's hands were still in the earth, resting there rather than working, and neither of them spoke, and the garden held them both in its cold, late afternoon quiet, asking nothing of either of them for the moment. In a house on the other side of the garden wall, someone had begun cooking. The smell of it arrived over the wall with the cold air, faint and warm, something with soy and something frying quietly, the ordinary comfort of the end of an ordinary day. Rin stood there in the cold beside the man who had, years ago, and without being asked, and without making anything of it, decided to take a difficult, suspicious, thoroughly prepared to be disappointed boy and simply keep him, who had fed him and enrolled him in school and stood up to a room full of relatives at a funeral, and who was now wearing floral gardening gloves in December because Hana had left them by the door, and tending her garden because she was no longer here to tend it herself. He thought about the word Kenji had used at the funeral, the easy flatness of it, his son, and he thought about the cleared square of earth in front of them, and he thought about the gardening gloves that were slightly too large for those hands but were being worn anyway, and he found himself very full of something that had no particular name but was not nothing. The afternoon was settling toward evening, the flat light softening at the edges, the cold coming down a degree or two more, the garden going still around them the way gardens go still as the day ends, everything slightly more itself in the last quiet light. Kenji shifted his weight, moving from a crouch to sitting back on his heels, his hands resting on his knees, still in the floral gloves, looking at what he had cleared, not satisfied, exactly, not the look of a task completed, but the look of someone who has made a start and knows it. Rin breathed in the smell of the turned earth and the cooking from next door and the cold itself. And he stood a little longer in the garden beside the man who had been his family for years now. Neither of them speaking, neither of them needing to, the cleared square of earth between them, and the chrysanthemums still needing attention all around them, and the evening coming in gently from all sides. And that, for this evening, is where we leave them, in the garden, in the cold, with the smell of dinner on the air and the last of the light going soft over the overgrown beds, in a small cleared square of earth where something will, eventually, grow again. And so we leave that hallway behind, its shadows settling back into silence, its story folding gently into the dark. There is no rush now. If you need a moment, take it. Let your breath come slow and easy. Let the weight of the night hold you just a little deeper into where you rest. Our next story takes us nowhere new, only further in. The same story continuing, the same night unfolding, quiet and unhurried, as all nights here tend to be. You do not need to follow closely. Simply let the words find you, soft as they are, drifting through whatever space remains between waking and sleep. From the wooden step where Run had stopped, still with the cold working through his socks, Kenji's back looked somehow smaller than he remembered, the shoulders drawn a little inward, the neck bent low, the whole silhouette folded close to the earth in the way of someone who is not working but listening. He was murmuring something, soft and low and not meant to be heard, and Rin did not try to make out the words, only stood on the step and watched the slow movement of those hands in the winter soil and felt the pale light moving through the bare branches overhead, and understood, without quite deciding, that his feet were going to carry him forward. He had not planned anything, had not rehearsed a single line, and the neighborhood was making its small, ordinary sounds around the yard. A wind chime 2 houses down, the far-off voice of someone's television, the soft scratch of a branch against the fence, sounds that made the silence of the garden feel more particular and more weighted by contrast. He moved off the step and into the frost cold of the garden, and as he crossed the few feet between them, something loosened in his chest in the way something loosens when a decision has already been made without asking permission, and the distance between him and Kenji became, in those last few steps, something his body could not continue to tolerate. His knees went, not from weakness alone, but from recognition, the body going ahead of the mind to the posture that the moment required. And he folded forward, hands flat on the cold earth, forehead pressing into the frost-dark soil beside Kenji's knee, in the old form of deep apology that his body seemed to know without having been taught. It was the posture of someone who has no argument left to make. And he told Kenji he was sorry, his voice strange and thick and close to the ground, sorry that he had been right there, on the sofa beside her bed, sleeping the deep sleep of someone who trusted that tomorrow would be the same as today all those nights. He had not stirred. That was the thing. Had not felt the change in the room, had not woken to whatever stillness had gathered in the small hours, had simply gone on sleeping while the woman who had made him rice balls and left lights on and worried about his exams had slipped away quietly while he lay 6 feet from her bed and did not notice. His forehead was cold against the earth, and he could smell the winter soil and the faint mineral sharpness of frost, and at the edge of his vision the bare stems of Hana's plants stood in their patient rows, and he pressed himself lower and told the ground what he needed to say, that he had been right there, that he should have woken, and understood that this was not a thing that could be unsaid into adequacy, only said and said again, and finally sat down. Kenji was still for a long moment, still enough that Ren could hear his own breath, could hear the wind chime 2 houses away, could hear the faint creak of the fence in the cold, and then both of Kenji's hands closed around the collar of Ren's jacket and pulled upward all at once, without hesitation. There was nothing gentle in it, not the careful touch of someone afraid of breaking something, but the grip of a man hauling someone back to the surface, firm and certain. And Ren came up from the ground in a single motion and found himself standing, blinking, mud and cold on his forehead, Kenji very close. Kenji's eyes were red at the edges and very bright, and he held Ren by the collar with both hands, and then asked it, not softly, not in the indoor voice of grief, but in his outdoor voice, the one that carried across the yard, asked Ren plainly what he was to him, who he was in the most direct possible terms. He asked it more than once, the same words each time, his voice cracking at the consonants in a way Ren had never heard before, the grip on the collar steady and unrelenting, and Ren understood with a clarity that arrived quietly, but arrived completely, that this was not a question with multiple possible answers. It was a request for the word that had been waiting in the space between them for years. What came out of Ren's mouth was not the careful word, not the polished word. It was the warm, rough, informal one, the slightly childish word, the one boys used carelessly about their fathers when they were not being formal, the word that felt both too small and exactly right. And he said it, and his face did what it was going to do regardless of his preferences. He was crying in the garden in January with mud on his forehead, which was not how he had imagined any of this. And a neighbor somewhere could certainly hear all of it if they chose to listen, and he found that this information was simply not available to act on in that particular moment. Kenji let go of the collar and pulled him in by the back of the neck, both arms around him, and they stood there in the winter garden being considerably less composed than either of them would have preferred, a great deal of sniffling, the kind of crying that announces itself. 2 men in a frost-cold yard, holding on. Kenji was patting the back of his head after a while, in a way that was firm and slightly clumsy and entirely correct, the pat of a man who does not have a great many gestures but uses the ones he is fully, and neither of them spoke for a long while, only stood and let the afternoon do its slow work around them. When they finally stepped apart, Kenji spoke in his carefully ordinary voice, the voice of a man who is choosing to be steady. Something about Hana, about how she would have wanted to hear it too, would have wanted Rin to go and say the same word to her as well. And Rin nodded because he could not yet trust his voice with a full sentence. Inside the house, the room where Hana's photograph now sat beside a lit candle and a cup of cold tea was quiet in the late afternoon way, the paper screens softening the remaining light into something without sharp edges, and Rin sat down at the low table on the tatami, found paper and a pen, and stayed for a moment without beginning. He did not know how long he sat before the first word came, long enough for the candle to move through some portion of its afternoon, long enough for the sound of the house to settle into something that felt like patience. And when the words finally started, they came the way long-held things come, not slowly at first, but all at once. He began with sorry, because that was where everything had to begin. Sorry he had not noticed, all those months, that something was different, that she moved through the house with a small new economy of effort, that the smile she gave him over exam results had started to carry something quiet and private behind it that he had been too young or too certain of tomorrow to understand. He wrote that he was sorry he had slept so easily in those hospital months, trusting in the way the young trust without examination that the warmth around them is permanent, that nothing changes in the night, that tomorrow will answer for today, trusting without checking, which is its own kind of failure, however ordinary a failure it is. He wrote that she had never once made him feel like a burden, not from the first afternoon. When she had appeared in a doorway with a school uniform, she had quietly altered to fit him, and a look on her face that was trying not to be too much and was exactly the right amount, and not in any of the years that followed. He wrote about the worry he had caused her, the exam she fretted over, the late nights when he pushed himself past what was reasonable, the time she appeared in the doorway of his room with something warm in her hands and a look that held both "you can do this" and also "please stop doing this to yourself" in that particular combination only certain people managed to carry in a single expression. And then he wrote the thing that had been waiting behind all the other things, the private admission that had been sitting in his chest through the months of her illness and the long quiet afterward, that he had wanted for years to call her mom, had known the word, had felt it ready in him, and had not been able to make his mouth say it. He was afraid of the pause, he told her, that half second after the word leaves the mouth and before a face decides what to receive, afraid that it would be long enough to show him something uncertain, that she might love him just as fully and still not quite know how to take that particular syllable from him, and that the not knowing would be its own kind of loss. So instead he had done it in secret. Once on a night near the end when the room was dark and her breathing was even and she was, to every appearance, fully asleep, he had leaned close and whispered the word once into the still air near her pillow, so quietly that the room itself could barely catch it. Just once, he wrote, and he had been sorry about that ever since. Not sorry he had said it, but sorry it had been a whisper to someone sleeping. Sorry he had taken the door that cost no courage. Sorry that the only time he had said the word had been to someone who could not answer. And this was the version of himself he could not quite forgive. He wrote about the rice balls, dried fish, and bonito, folded into the center, wrapped in foil, left outside his door on study nights with a single sticky note in her careful handwriting that said only the character for energy, no explanation, no ceremony. as though knowing what someone needed in the middle of the night and leaving it without being asked were simply what you did when you lived in a house with another person. He wrote about the dashimaki egg, the rolled sweet omelet she made on the mornings after examinations, golden and soft, placed on the table without comment, as though there were nothing remarkable about having noticed and having made it and having set it there before he came downstairs. And he wrote about coming home, the particular quality of a house where someone is waiting, the warmth of the entryway in winter, the smell of dinner beginning on the stove, the television in the next room. The way a house that holds another person is entirely different from a house that holds only silence. A difference he had nearly forgotten was possible before Kenji and Hana had opened their door to him. The candle had gone lower, and the room had grown softer by the time he was near the end. And through the paper screen he could hear Kenji in the kitchen, the ordinary sounds of a pot and a stove, the sounds of someone deciding, one small action at a time, to go on, and somewhere beneath the water and the heat, something low and tuneful that might have been a song Hana had liked. Rin wrote the word again, Mom, and then wrote it once more without apology, without the old fear, the way a note rings on after the hand lifts from the string, warm and sustaining, filling the space it had always deserved to fill, the space he had kept sealed for so long out of the fear that turned out to be smaller than the word itself. And he wrote that he loved her in the plainest words available, the ones without ornament, because she had not been a person who needed ornament, and he had not been especially skilled at it. And the plainest felt right, felt like the single character on a sticky note, like exactly enough, like the rice ball left without ceremony outside a closed door. When he set the pen down, the letter was longer than he had meant it to be, and his hand was a little cold, and something inside him was quieter than it had been in a long while, not resolved in any neat way, but the way a person feels after they have finally said the true thing to the person who most needed to hear it, in whatever form hearing takes when a body is no longer there. He folded the paper carefully and left it leaning against the frame of her photograph, close enough to the candle that the warmth would reach it through the night, and he breathed in the faint incense and the cold air moving under the door and the smell of the dinner beginning in the kitchen, and sat for a moment with his hands in his lap and his eyes on her face. She had known, probably he let this thought arrive without pressing it, only observed it settling, had known the shape of what he felt long before it had been given a name, in the same quiet way she had known when to leave the food and when to leave the light, the knowing that does not require to be named, but would have welcomed the telling a little, the way anyone holds a small space for the word they already know is on its way. Outside the paper screen, the January dark had come fully in, and the kitchen's sounds were steady and deliberate, and the old house held its warmth at the center and its cold at the edges in the way it always had, imperfectly, reliably, the way all the best things are held. Kenji called through the screen in his ordinary voice, and Rin answered in his, and there was this small, quiet exchange of two people confirming they're still here, which is its own kind of saying, I am here, you are here, this is still a house, and we're going to take care of each other in it. And so, if you're somewhere warm and still right now, and the night has settled around you, and your own breathing has grown slow and easy, perhaps that is where you can let this story rest, with the letter folded beside the candle, with the word finally written in full on the page, with the dinner coming warm in the kitchen and the two of them finding their way toward it together. That is where the story rests tonight. Not in the grief, though the grief was real and was its own kind of love, but in the word that arrived late and landed gently, and in the ordinary warmth of a house that keeps itself lit, one small evening at a time. And so we have reached the end of tonight's stories. The last voice has settled, the last chapter closed, and all that remains now is the quiet that surrounds you.